I've been lucky enough to know Daniel for a long time now. I think we have a very, like a lot of common interests, and I'm looking forward to give a broad overview of legal barbarians, identity, modern comparative law, and the global south. Um, I try to think of Chile and Colombia in a comparative perspective to briefly discuss this. Um, to start with the author, Daniel Bonilla Maldonado, a full professor at the Universidad of los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, is an accomplished scholar, but that has been able to climb the academic mountains that isolate the north of the South. And he writes about it. In a way, his writing is a powerful and very accurate and smart testimony. I would like to think of it in a way as a testimony. The discipline is international and comparative law as part of these Cambridge studies, but at the same time is so much more. When I read Daniel Bonilla's work, it's so much more than law, or the way in which law has been understood in Latin America mainly. I would like to think of comparative law as traditionally part of the standard of civilization. The book focuses on the potential of comparative law as a discipline that challenge now its civilizing mission initially. The book shed light of these implicit assumptions about law underlying different legal cultures, the forces that drives it, and the legal orders to be kept invisible, in the way in which people identities, narratives, and behaviors are intertwined with legal layers. Uh, I mean, the origin of comparative law in 1900 at Paris is this idea of convergence of different legal regimes toward the discovery of what they call a universal law produced by civilizing nations. But these civilizing missions towards barbaric societies uh, has been so clearly and powerful described by Bonilla in his book. The ways in which internal colonialism tried to distinguish indigenous peoples over their territories has been, I think, powerfully described through different strategies in the book. The doctrine of discovery, this idea of terra nullius, which in the Spanish case was accompanied by a religious mandate to convert and conquest made by the Pope Alexander VI through the Intercedera Bulls in 1493. But another way has been the disappearance of indigenous people through unilateral measures like conquest or uniform laws. And I don't know if you will agree with me, Daniel, but this is not only an historical account. I think we can go all the way to nowadays, to the unrest we see in our cities, in our countries. In Chile was in 2019, it has led us to a constituent assembly, a constituent process. But I think it's also what we're seeing now in Cali. I've been following the news, and in a way, this demand, this protest to be visible done by indigenous people is also unfolding before our eyes. Uh, I think to fully grasp the realities of the global south, this book employs an historical and comparative method as the basis of its pedagogy. Such an approach brings forward the history of colonization and the spread of Western values and the role that international law has in the construction of the colonies and what will later become newly independent nation states. Moreover, the lens of comparativism allowed to explore the effects of colonization on various jurisdictions around the world. I would like to call Boaventura de Sousa Santos' idea of an ecology of knowledge, affirming that there is no ignorance of knowledge in general. all ignorance is ignorant of a certain knowledge, and all knowledge is the triumph of a particular ignorance. In this way, we try to expand these possibilities that follow on the coexistence of the different cultures that make up the world in order to achieve a much more balanced distribution of scientific knowledge. I think the book focuses on shedding light on things that has been made invisible, that has been covered, that has been part of the what we call ignorance. In a way, I think we had the same experience of teaching, for example, indigenous legal orders, and some colleagues, but also some students were surprised that indigenous people had their own legal order, have their own legal knowledge, because law has been kept a part of indigenous people. The book also uses the historical role of international law in constructing this global order premised on conquest. This idea of shaping and designing models of governance. And then the questions are, how could be sovereignty conceptualized with respect of third world people? Or can be sovereignty conceptualized and defined by indigenous people? What is the structure of this global order? How can we imagine or create this global order from a third world perspective? I think we cannot refer, of course, all of the chapters of the book, but in the first 4 chapters, I think Daniel Bonilla elaborates a genealogy, so many difficult words. I mean, this can be shown as a real language barrier when we need to talk in a different language, right? But in these 4 chapters, he constructs a very powerful genealogy of modern comparative law about this barbarian legal dichotomy, subjects of law, as well as the notion of time and space. Each chapter can be read separately. I think it has an internal logic and represents different moments in history. Instrumental comparative law, comparative legislative studies, comparative law as an autonomous discipline since its creation in 1900 in Paris. And in every of these chapters, and in each of these chapters, Bonilla aspires to the same object, to understand the way in which comparative law has been contributed to the construction of the modern subject. Specifying the conceptual networks that allow the construction of the modern legal identities, examining the geographies that inhabit and the concept of history they experience. It marks an imagined border between Westerns and non-Westerns, hierarchies between legal families that occupy the place of like the mothers and others that are children. Even the acceptance that some are better than others. It finally translates into the conviction that only some cultures have the capacity to create law. What the law that is created from the South is a pseudo right, constituted by an autonomous and systems in the words of Daniel. I think there are so many other questions that come from the reading of this book. This idea, for example, if we can constitutional, in the way it has been constructed in the liberal constitutional tradition, burn, how can we reimagine humanism, notwithstanding the global capitalist marketization and commodification through law? Can we think of a politics of recognition? Can we think of an indigenous constitutionalism? It's indigenous constitutionalism possible through the current constitutional framework? What does revitalization look like from a non-Western constitutional order? I think Bonilla is clear from the beginning that every intellectual movement he addresses in the last chapters is really not monolithic and pursue different objectives. the question of the imperial dimension of international law, the criticism of neo-colonial legal relations, or the questioning of these traditional methods and objectives of comparative law. The three movements he addresses at the final chapter share some elements that constitute the object of analysis of this chapter, and according to Daniel, seeks to describe and analyze the way in which the three interact with the thought and structure of comparative law that underpins modern law. This is the electoral movement qualified through structures as dominant, and sometimes we can, of course, evaluate them from the critical and maybe pessimistic perspective. But I do think Daniel Bonilla's book and his thoughts about comparative law and how a history and international law has created what we call, or what we need to think of, a global order, can put into questioning. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I think we need to shed light on what is happening now in Latin America. We're facing a very critical moment. We're facing a moment, and maybe, and what we maybe are putting into question the very fundamental pillars of the legal order, of the way in which the legal orders in Colombia and in Chile are being constructed. I am optimistic in the way that we think we can build a different constitutional order. One that is much more inclusive, one that really gives space for women, for sexual minorities, for indigenous people. And I do think that a comparative exercise between Colombia and Chile, and between all Latin America, can be constructed to build something different. Not to stop thinking of Europe or other northern spaces as comparators, but to maybe to compare among ourselves and to look among ourselves in a much more critical way. Many thanks, Daniel, for writing this book. I think it will be a very relevant topic of discussion. And I think you are one of a kind as a scholar, not only for giving the North a text that was originally written in Spanish, to give the North a reflection, think of something unique from the South. I think, congratulations again. Many thanks for inviting me. I feel special for your invitation.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for your very generous words. And thank you also for connecting your thoughts about the book with the situation that we are experiencing right now in Colombia and in other parts of Latin America. Yeah. So if it's okay with you, Gabriela, we can start the first panel.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you so much for your introduction words, Professor Amaya. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the first panel of this event. This panel is called Law, Culture, and Identity. The dynamic of the event will be the next one, and it's that our three lead panelists will have 15 minutes to make their interventions. Afterwards, Professor Bonilla will have some time to answer to these interventions. And I will ask to the public if they could please write the questions they have to the chat in the chat, so that I can see them, and I will read some of these questions at the end of Professor Bonilla's intervention, so that we can have some sort of dialogue with the public while we stay between the range of time we have for this panel. It will be from it started from 9:15 and it will go to 10:45 in the morning, so we have to stay between those times. For the panelists, they will see me showing them a little paper, seeing that they have 2 minutes left when they have only 2 minutes, so that they can know they have to close their interventions. That's it for the dynamics of the event. welcome again. In this part of the event, we will be discussing what Professor Bonilla very interestingly puts in his book about the intricate relationship between law and culture, specifically in this time, comparative modern law and culture, and how that relationship that is continuously working through both sides of culture and law ends up construing subjectivities and ends up construing us as subjects, either legal subjects or barbarians. I think, therefore, it is very interesting to have this discussion with our three particular panelists. We will be having the interventions of Professor Patricia Zalamea. She is the Dean of the Facultad of Artes and Humanidades in Los Andes University. She holds a PhD in arts and a master's in Rutgers University, New Jersey. And she is interested, all of our panelists are interested and have made many publications in the topics of multiculturalism and the construction of subjectivities and identities related with this idea of multiculturalism. Our second panelist is Professor Gurpreet Mahajan. She's also a PhD and lead investigator at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She has a particular emphasis on hermeneutics, democratic theory, multiculturalism, religion, state, and civil society. And our final panelist is Professor Martin Ramstedt. He has a Dr. Phil from the Martin Luther University in Halle and a Dr. Phil from Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. He is now a senior researcher at the Department of Law and Anthropology at the Max Planck Institute for Asian Studies, and he is leading a research project in the project group Legal Pluralism at the MPI in Halle. All of our panelists have been broadly given many awards and on their different publications and fellowships to work in the universities I have already mentioned. And so we feel very honored and privileged to have all of you here with us today in this event. So I think it would be good if we follow the order that we have in the flyer. If we could start maybe with the presentation of Dr. Martin Ramstedt. Thank you. You have 15 minutes and I will show you the little paper when you have only 2 minutes left.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, and thank you very much, Daniel, for inviting me to this wonderful book launch event, because I really value that we have an in-depth discussion with different from scholars from different disciplines and background, and also from different geographical locations. And speaking of location, it's good to start with from which standpoint I will speak. I will speak as an anthropologist who has come to law in my analysis of the juridification of customary law and religious law, Islamic law in Indonesia, where I have worked for over 30 years. And I have then come to the sociology of law by ways I don't have to describe it here, but I'm currently, maybe that hasn't been missing in my introduction, I'm currently the scientific director of the Oñati International Institute for the Sociology of Law in Spain. So my view is really from as an outsider in the field of law, and but I can already say now, by way of starting, that I really agree with all the content, particularly the value and the analysis which you have presented, and I particularly value that because you are an insider, a privileged player in the field of comparative legal studies of international law. Having said this, I want to really zoom in on individual tenets of the book, and also on the methodology. Let's start with the major tenets and positions of the book. Law is a form of imagining reality. Yes, I totally agree. And I think that every cultural analysis, in-depth cultural analysis, social political analysis should really cannot do without an analysis of law and the social life of law, as it were. Yes, there's no individual outside the law. Law constructs the subject. You said both the individual subject, you focused on the individual subject. Of course, it also very much constructs collective identities, as we see in the case of indigenous peoples. Not all who claim to be, who have actually a right, or I think many scholars think that they have a right to the designation of indigenous peoples, are not given that status by their jurists, by their national jurists and their national law. So yes, law creates the space and time subjects inhabit, yes. This is very well, I think, well established by the legal geography approach, for instance, and also that law creates time, temporalities, culturally inflected temporalities. Yes, that is also well established. I can just refer to a special issue published in 2040 by Kebet van Benner Beckman, Weiber and myself on temporalities of law. The role that law has in the construction of individual identities, of course, varies among cultural communities. Yes, that has been demonstrated very much by anthropologists all around the world. And also that law how law is conceived varies between one community and another. Yes, and various communities can understand themselves as part of a cultural narrative that is formally formed by a single set of legal discourse and practices. Yes, I think that has played out in the indigenous rights movement and other movements, and is also very much conceptually theorized, conceptually grasped by Boaventura de Sousa Santos' epistemologies of the South, which are not only including theories or approaches from the geographical South. It also includes counter-hegemonic epistemologies in the global North, for instance. Yes, identities are constructed in dialogue. Yes, that is also a well-affirmed tenet in anthropology and also sociology. I also agree that the statement that law is an integral part of modern culture and not the outcome of modern culture. Yes, this is a well-established tenet. It is not new, but probably it is very new in the field you are part of. I agree to the tenets. I might differ from how they are introduced, presented. As an anthropologist, I would always emphasize an inductive way, an empirical demonstration, why that is true, why that is the case. You coming from law, I totally understand. It's more a normative statement almost. It's more like a manifesto. I think that was what Amaya said, which is fine, but we are also here to discuss some other sides that might not be so obvious to some. Then I particularly take issue with the following statement. Comparative law has consequently fulfilled a function analogous to what ethnography and anthropology have fulfilled in other areas of modern culture. I take issue with it because I only agree as to that it applies to colonial ethnography and colonial anthropology. I would think that maybe only in the global North, I cannot really say so much about Latin American ethnographical or anthropological traditions. But for the post-colonial anthropology in the global North, I think it's right to say, justified to say that it has seriously, incredibly engaged in projects of rendering alien ways of life comprehensible to a wide range of people in the global north. And I agree with Daniel's statement that understanding is a necessary condition for transformation. And I think that has led, anthropology has contributed to an emancipation of hitherto oppressed lifestyles and worldviews. And of course, yes, that is granted. Any understanding is always also culturally inflected, and that holds true also for contemporary efforts at cultural translations of let's say, indigenous or non-hegemonic or counter-hegemonic points of view and lifestyles. Post-colonial anthropology has been instrumental in generating support among the peoples of the global north for the indigenous rights movements, ecological and pro-democracy movements. And I do not see how comparative law as a discipline has achieved something similar, given the very, very strong involvement of comparative law scholars in law export and the issuance of and design of legal transplants. So that is one major issue I want to advance here. The critical academic also explores the role that international organizations like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank play in the constructions of the primitive other by means of the use of categories like modernization and development, you write. Yes, but why did you not also engage more deeply with relevant work by other global South scholars, if you want to position yourself as such, like Anthony Angie, Balakrishnan Rajagopal, or Sundya Rahuja, not to mention other scholars from the global north, like Tanya Lee and so forth, who have really criticized or shed a critical light on how the IMF and the World Bank further, the oppression of global South lifestyles and epistemologies by their promotion of development in relation to a more Western understanding of human rights and so forth. To explore the relationship between narrative and identity, methodologically speaking, just focusing on narrative is somewhat dated. It's not invalid, though. But I think we should also include embodiment, and here not just an analysis of habitus, but also performance, and as well as practice at large. I just want to refer here to Werner Gebhardt's Center of Advanced Studies, Law as Culture in Bonn. It has come to an end this year, but he very much promoted an understanding of the culture of law that not only integrates black letter law and rhetoric style and so forth, but also performance in courts, legal procedures, the way institutions are actually interrelated in a certain country. I think that is, if we talk about the culture of law, law as culture, I think that is important. It's that it's not just verbal expression, which is of course something what lawyers and legal scholars have traditionally focused on. Narratives give unity to identity, you write. Unity of identity is the consequence of the stories we tell about ourselves. Yes, I agree, but nowadays, really, this is almost a truism. It really, you have mentioned Gayatri Spivak and others in your book, but again, I'm almost craving for, and I will encourage you to more deeply engage on a theoretical level. Of course, you might not have focused on writing an over-theorized book, then it wouldn't have probably the impact you are seeking, and which was also voiced by Amaya and also, I think, by Gabriela. I understand, but at a certain point in time, I would really encourage you to engage more deeply with other post-colonial studies scholars and those who really want to promote other viewpoints in law as lawyers. A last point, perhaps, is the lack of proposition of an alternative methodology for comparative law studies that goes beyond the construction of external classificatory categories, such as different sets of legal families, in order to service Western or Northern projects of law export, and that go beyond essentialization of collective identities, including scholars of the North, Global North, and scholars of the Global South, because who are these scholars? Are you a scholar of the Global South? Am I a scholar of the Global North? What does that mean? I think it needs it begs for further discussion, I think. And having said that, I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that even in colonial times, there were emancipatory movements, like let's say the Adatrecht school, founded by Cornelis van Vollenhoven in Leiden in the Netherlands, who really tried to emancipate customary law as law, or Max Gluckman in the Rhodes Livingston Institute, who did the same, or tried to do, sought to do the same for African legal systems. Here, and I would really plea for a deeper engagement also with Paul Schiff-Berman's ideas on global legal pluralism, and De Sousa Santos' project that he formulates also in the end of the cognitive empire, not only in the epistemologies of the South. A deeper engagement is also due to a host of studies that have inquired into the asymmetrical power constellations and hegemonic interests behind law export or legal transplants, which I would rather reformulate as hegemonic efforts of transplanting legal norms and institutions to societies against the will of their members. And then we also have to just bear in mind that it should not end there, just working for the emancipation of global South epistemologies. We also should strive, or not forget, the question: what is fair? What is just? What is justice in a constellation of plural normative orders? I think that would be my input for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Martin. We will then continue with Professor Patricia Zalamea's intervention. Thank you.
So good morning, good evening to everyone. I would also like to begin with a special thanks to Daniel for inviting me to read and comment on your book. In other words, for bringing me back into the world of law and culture after sending me off into art history to begin with. So that's a bit of an internal joke that we might reveal later on, but the point is that I'm truly delighted to be here, now able to think about law through the perspective of art and visual culture. So that being said, I'm going to share my screen in order to comment on legal barbarians by using a series of visual glosses, or rather a visual narrative. So bear with me just a second while I put this together. So I think you're all able to see my screen by now. So I would like to begin my comments with a very cultural artifact that opens the book, literally speaking. I'm referring to this image on the frontispiece, which reappears in the written narrative and plays a central role in the rhetoric of the book. The photographic portrait of a young Black figure sitting in a classicizing pose, eyes looking off into the distance, body poised and yet subtly shifting away from the viewer, while enveloped in the colorful patterns that also make up the background of the image. The ultimate touch of the self-conscious, highly artificial mise-en-scène would appear to be the soccer ball held under the arm, an element that destabilizes the viewer's expectations and questions the very setup itself. This photograph, as we learn later on in the book, offers an analogy to the objectives of legal barbarians. According to Bonilla, the work of Omar Victor Diop, a contemporary Senegalese photographer, allows him to further specify his own approach to modern comparative law. Although developed in a footnote, the artist's comments about his work meaningfully reveal how soccer functions as a very emblem of globalization, while serving as a pictorial trope in photographic compositions that explore historical and visual representations of an African diaspora. Not only does his Moroccan man call into question contemporary issues regarding collective identity, but also points to specific historical references, such as this painting by a 19th century Catalan artist who specialized in Orientalism, thus introducing yet another level of otherness. Similarly, Diop figures as Don Miguel de Castro, a 17th century emissary of Congo to the Dutch Republic, matching the regalia of the original painting with goalkeeper's gloves, which have been inserted into the composition with a degree of hyperrealism that serves to exalt yet another meaningful level in this complex representation. Indeed, Diop's multi-layered images point to the contradictions that underlie diverse attempts at representing an African identity, in particular when that other did not fulfill the expectations of his or her European counterparts, or rather superiors in the one-directional sense in which juxtaposed identities could be defined through modern comparative law. As noted by Bonilla, Diop, who uses his own image as the subject of his representations, is the very, quote, consequence of a cultural dialogue with the global north. In other words, the artist's subjectivity and that of his images are inseparable from the cultural exchange that occurs in the network of representations that cross from the global north into the global south and back full term. In using a different medium, Bonilla emphasizes the very arguments of his narrative. Indeed, the questions posed by Diop's imagery seem to reinforce those at the very heart of the issues resulting from the inextricable process of cultural construction of identities and the development and application of comparative law. Indeed, by playing on the very genre of portraiture, in itself a Western product and conception of individuality that developed during the early modern period, not unlike the very genealogy of comparative law, Diop opens questions about individual and collective identity. What does it mean to insert one's own body within a portrait-like image? What I'm saying here is that just as Bonilla recalls the ways in which comparative law has forged modern identities by opposing them to the colonial, marginalized other, Diop fuses not only tropes loosely connected to certain notions of a generic African identity along with his own individual features, but also the contradictions of a Eurocentric genre, that of the individual portrait reserved for specific elite and social class. While curtains and cloths serve as a reminder of royal portraiture, the round soccer ball has replaced the orb of power of such portraits. Indeed, the very definition of the genre is exacerbated by the inclusion of so-called self-portraits, which in truth are more like a masquerade. While it is true that Diop does name the series as self-portraits, the issue is open-ended and doubles onto itself, leaving the reader-viewer struggling with the very limits of defining the genre, an issue that Bonilla also grapples with when searching for the terms to describe such images. What I find to be particularly interesting is that Bonilla's use of imagery as argument departs from other uses of images in narratives that rely on the written word as their principal vehicle of expression. In other words, the appearance of specific images within his narrative is not reduced to an illustrative purpose. the images offer an in-between space, while they also intersect with the arguments provided in the book. On the one hand, they both surprise and challenge the reader, turning her into a viewer. On the other hand, an incursion into these images shows them departing from predominant narratives, even offering alternative viewpoints. In fact, I think these images do more than provide an analogy. As noted by Bonilla, these photographs reveal discontinuities and not just continuities with tradition, as is the case when Diop relies on humor and inserts soccer as a motif into his visual narrative, thus jarring with the historical references while simultaneously playing on the new heroic identities of African soccer players in Europe. One of Bonilla's approaches is to trace the genealogy of comparative law, concluding that although a series of critiques have emerged as an approach to comparative law itself, an all-encompassing theory has not been produced to replace the methods of comparative law. Perhaps, I wonder, could images serve this very purpose? As a different medium, one that reveals narratives in multiple yet simultaneous layers rather than the form of sequential arguments, visual images serve to highlight the very contradictions of comparing and contrasting on a binary level, a method that would appear to be inescapable for comparative law, itself construed from a specific perspective that is based on the opposition between North and South, East and West, metropolitan versus colonial, and so forth. On the other hand, the very method of comparing and contrasting made me realize, as an art historian, the ways in which images work in of themselves, and how we can turn them into critical counter-narratives as we compose and recompose them, placing them side by side to one another. Thus, images offer us not just a possibility of constructing counter-narratives, but of shaking our consciousness of the very power that comparative law holds over us, one of the critical topics broached by Bonilla. Towards the end of the book, another image serves to close in on the arguments regarding hybridity, wherein dominant and native or minor narratives come together in the formation of cultural identities. If legal hybridity allows for the creation of spaces of resistance, as argued by Bonilla, the very notion of hybridity makes it harder to distinguish between subjects of law and legal barbarians. Such strategies of hybridization come, in fact, from fields outside of law, as noted by Bonilla. In the world of the vice-regal Spanish Americas, for example, the production of new imagery with a didactic evangelizing purpose in mind depended on the interaction of specific cultural practices, both local traditions and imported styles, techniques, and beliefs. Often termed as syncretic imagery, these works reveal the complexity of cultural hybridity, wherein it is no longer possible to distinguish the subject of law as insiders versus the outsiders or barbarians of a colonial network. Indeed, local indigenous artists assimilated and transformed the iconographies and styles of multiple intersecting traditions. This is why the Virgin Mary is inextricable from the mountain of Potosi and the very territory in which these new images emerged. There is no longer a them and us, or here and there, but rather a new specific form of hybrid identity. The very question of identity, then, becomes inseparable from individual and collective notions. This particular example leads Bonilla towards a question regarding the rights of nature, in the particular case of Ecuador and its constitution from 2008. If identity is not conceived of as individual, but rather tied to one's natural surroundings, whereby the individual body is inseparable from land and territory, this may well indicate a transformation of the conventions of modern comparative law and its narratives. The work of Abel Rodriguez, a sage from the Nonuya people, displaced from his native home in the Amazons due to the Colombian armed conflict of the 1990s, offers another visual commentary on the rights of nature as an example of legal hybridity. While drawing species from memory and producing a classification based on ancestral knowledge of medicinal plants and ecological systems, Rodriguez offers a critical counter-narrative to the ways in which nature is scientifically classified, ordered, and subordinated. Finally, this brings me to another set of contrasting images as a commentary on the arguments offered in Legal Barbarians. These are images that we have witnessed on a daily basis as part of the social protests that have taken place throughout Colombia in the past 2 weeks. Most recently, on May 7th, a group of Misak women overthrew a sculpture of the Spanish conquistador Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, known as the founder of the colonial city of Santa Fe de Bogotá in the 16th century. As noted by Bonilla, in Latin America, legal histories tend to begin with the Spanish conquest and the colonial period. I should note that this has been the case for traditional histories of Colombian art, thereby placing pre-Hispanic art into a prehistoric limbo. Just yesterday, the Misak's gesture went further in rebaptizing the Avenida Jimenez, a central avenue in the historic center of the city, as Avenida Misak, as you can see here on the right. Such gestures of reappropriation and displacement have not only rendered inanimate objects with their symbolic value, but have also made long-standing cultural processes visible for us all, while calling into question the very issue at stake in comparative law and its definition of subjectivities within a dominant legal system. In contrast, the reporting in the main media has insisted on the use of phrases that refer to a supposed confrontation between citizens, quote, versus natives, indígenas, while leading to an outcry on social media. Are indígenas not citizens? Major newspapers blindly insisted on using the same terminology. I end then with the issue of how Legal Barbarians offers us a lens to analyze our post-colonial complexities by realizing how the very dynamics of the interrelations between a global North and a global South can be replicated within a single territory on a local level, wherein diverse identities coexist but are still deemed as opposites by the society that inhabits that very nation. On the other hand, the inclusion of such visual narratives within studies of comparative law, a point emphasized by Bonilla in his call for interdisciplinary work, may serve not just to exemplify, but to transform the very ways in which legal systems operate. So thank you again. Thank you for bearing with me and my images. Thank you, Daniel, again.
Thank you so much, Professor Zalamea, for bringing this very interesting topic we are all thinking at the back of our minds right now. And now I give the space to Professor Gurpreet, please, to carry on with your.
Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, Daniel, for giving me this opportunity. I feel privileged because I've had now an opportunity to read an advanced copy of the book and get the benefit of that. The last time I think one collaborated with your projects, we were discussing how law and judicial pronouncements have really constructed identities and dealt with issues of minorities in the global South. And when I read this book, it pushed me beyond that, and I was really struck by the central argument. Of course, listening to the two panelists before me, I can see that it is to the richness of the book, that it offers so many different perspectives from which one could read it. And I must say, I read it as a student of political philosophy, as a person interested in issues of identity and diversity and so on and so forth, coming from another part of the global South. I'm from India. That's the other vantage point I thought I should share with you, because I really found the main argument so striking, sharp, and succinctly placed. And now, of course, hearing the panelists, and I've yet to hear Daniel on the subject, one will need to read the book again, because so much of it is in the fine print, in the footnotes. And I must confess, I have not been able to read all of them. I read them selectively, things that were of interest to me, but that's also a reason to go back and revisit the book over and over again. And I must say that what I liked, I'm going to focus on the way I read the book, what struck me most, and the thoughts that came to me, when I put the book down, let's put it like that, or as I was reading along. I must say that thank you for introducing me to the concept of legal barbarian. coming from a place which was colonized, one was familiar with the dichotomy between the enlightened West, which is rational and modern and so on and so forth, and barbarians or people who were just not ready to govern themselves. So that was the colonized people. And I had worked with that kind of dichotomy for a long time. And I think reading your book introduced me to this idea that actually it's a little more subtle, that you could inhabit a point in between. You could be a legal barbarian, which means that it's not a contrast between stateless societies or societies without law and those which have law or rational modern law, but it's actually a subtle classification where you could have laws, but because they come from custom or religion or or they don't have the ingredient of contract or autonomy as the central category, you could be classified as the legal barbarian. And I think that's something I'm going to think about over and over again. And then by the time I got to the chapter by Henry Maine, where you deal with Henry Maine's classification, you introduced actually a third element in that, in what was earlier dualism, which is your subject of law, of course, we leave that, legal barbarian, and then there is the rest of the world, the uncivilized, which you've not even noted. But now you begin to, I became aware of the fact that you could be brought into the discourse of the global north, and yet remain within a hierarchy where you are placed as a legal barbarian for a variety of different indicators. And I thought, so I really, this is a conceptual, I think, idea that you have left me with, and I need to think about it a lot more, and I found this very, very helpful. And I'm going to just share with you what I found helpful when I was thinking of the way you elaborated this category and brought the focus on this middle ground, something called legal barbarian. For instance, as a student of political philosophy, I'm kind of familiar with Montesquieu's work and the fact that he related geography with customs and laws that prevail in a particular place. So I knew that he had described the parts where I live as a hot, climate where people are lazy, they don't do much work, so they don't have a rational temperament, they are passionate, and so on and so forth. Of course, you pointed out that they're also sensitive, so kudos for that. But so he has things about customs being shaped by geography. So why there is a taboo on alcohol, why certain kinds of foods are not consumed in the South, which are hot climates, etc. But you brought my attention to the additional point that in actually constructing and making this link between geography and climate, and for one sake, and custom and law, he's actually also creating simultaneously a hierarchy. And I think the passages that you highlighted in the text in your book from Montesquieu actually highlighted that. So I thought that's another element that I learned, that it's not merely because you could, against the Enlightenment, see this as a major deviation, because a comparative perspective, it is talking about understanding the diversity of customs and laws that exist. But in the process of doing that, actually, he's creating a hierarchy, which you brought out, I think, so well, and I really benefited from that. And similarly, I want to use the chapter on Henry Maine as a second illustration of what I have in mind in terms of what it has made me think about. Henry Maine occupies a very important position in the Indian colonial history, because we think in terms of the presence of Macaulay as a turning point. Before Macaulay comes on the scene, there is space for existing rules and laws and customs to prevail. And the empire doesn't, the East India Company, which is working as the colonial authority at that time, wants the local rules and customs to prevail and different groups to be governed by them. And we have Macaulay then, who wants to impose a much more English attitude, behavior, way of thinking, conduct, etc., etc. So this is the contrast. And in this contrast, it is customary, and often one thinks of it, that people like Henry Maine had respect for diversity. He understood that these were also, that there existed these ancient civilizations, which he talks about, Hindu and Islamic civilization, which have had a long history. And therefore, the rules by which these communities are governed should continue to be there. And then he, of course, undertakes the task of codifying the laws. So again, Daniel, thank you for pointing out, I think, two other elements yet again, that actually codification is the second stage of arriving at or moving towards or transiting towards something which is rational. So the project, which appears to be one of respecting diversity and accommodating that diversity and accepting that these local customs and rules and laws that have prevailed should continue to govern, is actually another mode of reaffirming hierarchy. And it's another mode because behind it is the idea that these are people who will remain in the infancy, the past of Europe, as it were. So there is a link between Europe, but they remain at the first stage of infancy, never likely to grow up. So I thought this was a very interesting, subtle thought and an idea that one needs to hold on to, because behind sometimes a seeming respect for diversity can also be a structure of hierarchy that is being reinforced, and one needs to be alert about it. So thank you for alerting one to that. So those were the two takeaways immediately that I had in terms of, and this was quite an eye-opener for me, and I'm going to integrate it in some of my writings later on. The point I want to really focus on, and I think here Martin and I have a difference, which would be interesting for discussion. I really liked the centrality accorded to the narrative mode, because I think narrative is a quintessentially anti-positivist, non-liberal way of understanding and analyzing something. And I'm going to give a context to this, other than merely talking. Maybe later on with time we'll talk about what I associate with the narrative. But I just want to give two examples. The first time I actually visited the West, I was in England, and the question that would come up frequently is, which was asked to me, which I'm a person from Global South, why is it that people from the Global South Asia always respond by telling a story or giving an example? And inherent here was the idea that in Europe, we really think in terms of arguments, or you think of analysis in terms of classifying, defining, separating. These are the modes of communication which are accepted as desirable, scientific, communicative, etc., etc. The narrative, is something which is strangely the other, and it has been constructed like that. And yet again, a decade and a half, this was around 1990 or something, and about a decade and a half later, many of us, and some with lead people from Canada, from North America, very interested in thinking about the classroom, which is now becoming global classroom, where there are students from various parts of the world. So how do you teach political philosophy, which often is Western political philosophy and the canon of Western political philosophy, in a global classroom? And again, one of the suggestions that came from somebody who's very sympathetic to the need to make an adjustment suggested that we need to move away from an analytical and argumentative mode of disseminating information, of that kind of mode of inquiry, into something else, which I thought subtly was into something else, which is narrative. Okay, assuming, I think this idea which you had, it made me think of all these various things or experiences of oneself, that here, how does an idea which has got constructed perhaps in a different field, but that notion of what is rational gets imbibed and becomes part of our subjectivity, whether we are part of Global South or Global North. And this is how the communication really begins. And then we begin to place and even assess modes of analysis outside of philosophy of history, which has given some narrative, in certain kinds of ways. So I really, really liked, I think you could have done more with the narrative, in the sense that I would, but obviously a book can't do everything, but I like the suggestion of using the metaphor and the conceptual vocabularies associated with the narrative in the presentation of this. And I thought as a methodology, it fits in so well with the central argument, where you are really questioning the whole project, which has come with a liberal, capitalist, modern society, which is thinking of individual autonomy, rationality in certain kinds of ways. So I particularly, wanted to draw one's attention to that. In recent times, of course, one must confess, I think this has been mentioned by the panelists, that there are changes occurring in the global north. And one of the people who has talked about narrative, perhaps almost in ways very reminiscent of you, Daniel, of narrative is Alistair McIntyre, who in his criticism of liberalism uses the idea of narrative as a way of thinking about the unity of life, and then unity of the life of a person as connected also with the life of the community, of the larger collective of which you are a part. And he writes that when you think in terms of separate individuals, you lose sight of this. When you think in terms of just separate episodes or events, again, you lose sight of it. It is this narrative continuity which allows you to connect this. And that's very much part of your thing. But I don't want to end there, because I thought there was something more, which I am particularly sympathetic to, because this is a field that I had some interest in, part of my early PhD work. This is an idea I think I associated earlier with Paul Ricoeur, but I find it there, because narrative mode is not about storytelling. It's not about beginning at this point of, where did it all begin on the day such and such as we started moving out of this place and so on and so forth, and ending in a certain place. The narrative you have constructed, and I think such a great example, has an underlying structure. And that's what's important, that in each chapter, the narrative, the genealogy which we are talking about, actually unfolds an underlying structure, which of course in this case also gets elements of it get redefined, because legislative studies and tort studies or conceiving law in terms of legal families is different. So there are differences that do take place, but the underlying structure gets rehearsed and constructed afresh and many times, over and over again. And I think when you begin to understand that you can talk about the structural components while using the narrative mode, one begins to challenge this idea that there is a rational analytic mode as opposed to something other, which is going to be just storytelling and so on and so forth. And these are the elements that I'm going to take with me and use them as examples over and over again. So, but the richness of the book is that it leaves one thinking about so many different things. I'm not sure how much time I have, but I want to also share some thoughts that occurred to me, the questions that came to my mind through this, particularly by the time I approached the last chapter, where you're talking about the third word, alternatives. And I'm not familiar with everybody, but I know the works of some of these people, many of whom are writing about alternatives available to us, or which we should explore to challenge the manner in which the global order is constructed, the way it is functioning, and even as you mentioned, the teaching of the discipline is really undertaken, and the studies of law are undertaken. So there are these alternatives, and I was thinking that actually today there are these alternatives, and you find that they're coming from the side of universities and institutions, academia, intellectuals primarily are engaged in this. And I thought that actually, if I look at, I'm sure every colonized area, and I'm thinking of my own first, during the struggle for independence against colonial rule, a similar perspective was presented. There were many political leaders in India who were thinking in terms of challenging the dominant narrative which was being, given through the colonizers, by retrieving indigenous traditions, or by thinking in terms of the need to recover them, even if not, being successful in doing so completely. And they focused on that. So I thought there is that early moment that we need to grasp. But I'm also left with a couple of other supplementary questions linked to this, namely that this is how, as you presented, this is how the global north constructed us in the global south. But why is it that the global south accepted this? What makes a construction so successful? Of course, difference of power. This is a glaring thing, and obviously this makes a huge difference and certainly is there. But there is another element, I think, that also we need as we move forward. We need to think about, and this remains a big stumbling block for us here. Was there something in the indigenous traditions? I'm just saying indigenous, okay. In the traditions, let's say in India, I don't want to say indigenous here only, just people here, the traditions that were prevalent prior to colonization, were there certain elements within it, certain forms of hierarchies and exclusions that were there, that left that answer a little unsatisfactory? And therefore, my next thought that came to my mind, is it possible to abandon the hierarchy that comparative law or modern law, invariably constructs us with? Is it at all possible to abandon that and question that, not abandon it, but challenge it, and yet retrieve the idea that we could think in terms of notions of inclusiveness, equality, autonomy? These are sort of abstract, somewhat empty concepts, because so much different meaning has been placed by struggles of people at different times. But is it possible really to do something like that? And lastly, I was thinking that should we also say that subjectivity is constructed dialogically? And you mentioned Charles Taylor, and he came to mind immediately, because we have a construction of ourselves, but the manner in which others construct us, we are coerced in some sense, willingly or otherwise, may not be coerced, but we nevertheless engage in that kind of dialogue with it. And we, maybe we do it in the kind of image that you said, try to insert yourself in that picture of Madonna. But invariably, there is this dialogue, and maybe that's what we need to move towards again, that as we are thinking in terms of challenging the global north, I think we need to retrieve that space for ourselves to challenge, but it may have to happen dialogically. And because, as you point out, there are spaces available even within global north for that, maybe that's something that we could think in terms of and pursue, rather than dichotomizing it completely as we move forward, because in the dialogue, there will need to be some kind of exchange, as it were, a sharing of views. But thank you so much. It made me think about so many things and much more, but there isn't time for that, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gurpreet. Maybe at the end, we will be able to open a little bit of dialogue between all of you. That would be very good. But for now, Professor Bonilla, I give you the word.
Thank you, Gabriela. And thank you, Patricia, Gurpreet, and Martin, for all the comments, critiques, and questions. Really interesting and useful, and make me think about the book in many different ways, trying to see what are the weak spots of the book and what might be some contributions to the discussion on issues that are of common. I would like to start with the point about narrative that Gurpreet made. I think that what is useful about narrative when we talk about the construction of identities is that it offers an alternative to two very traditional ways of thinking about identity and the process of identity. The first one is, essentializing identities, right? And the idea that there are different ways, different paths to making explicit understanding and analyzing what supposedly human beings are. By nature, by divine creation, right? But there's something that can be discovered and analyzed as a constitutive element of what an individual or a community are. The other option, the other alternative that is in the other extreme of this range is the one that focuses on change. Right? It says, well, identities are continuously changing. There's nothing that we can call an essence of collective or individual identities. And I think that both views are problematic. The first one because I believe that there is nothing that we can call an essence of our identities, that there's nothing that we can recognize through introspection, or that we can recognize through some kind of rational analysis that is not constructed. Of course, there is an element that is connected to nature, but mostly what we think we are is constructed in dialogue with others. Structural, it is a social, a cultural concept. The problem with the other option is that it fails to grasp the experience that we have with our identities that is, in a way, stable. We do have certain elements of our identities that are stable. They're not, of course, essential, they're not natural, but they do not change rapidly. And those elements, right, are the ones that give us some sense of who we are, how we understand ourselves, and how can we give meaning to what we do, and how can we give meaning to the world we interact with daily. What narrative does is to be able to, is to offer us a conceptual path to give an account, plausible account, of both stability and change in the processes of identity construction. We do believe through these narratives that we create in dialogue with others, that we have certain elements that are central to who we are, although we recognize that these elements can change and that they are socially constructed. And at the same time, it allows the possibility for changing these ways of understanding who we are. There is then the possibility of realizing how identities can change and how can will play a role in these processes. And at the same time, this reflection about narrative shows the limits that individual will has for changing our identities, in the sense that the view that others have about who we are is also important in this process, is something that is it is a view that cannot be marginalized. We cannot protect ourselves completely from the gaze of the others. And that, I think, is why it is important for the book, this idea of narrative. Of course, not only because it gives us an alternative to think about identity, collective and individual identity in general, but because it allows us to think how parts of who we are individually and collectively were and have been and are constructed by law, and how comparative law also has played an important role in this process of identity construction. Law has provided some materials for both constructing the other and the self, and that, I think, is one of the key arguments of the book. How we can find both continuities and discontinuities in this genealogy. The discontinuity, the continuity, it can be found in the conceptual opposition between the legal barbarian and subject of rights, right? This we can find in all the moments that constitute this genealogy of modern law. But at the same time, what we find is that this narrative changes over time within comparative law, and therefore within modern law. Because in each moment that constitutes this genealogy, the content of the conceptual opposition changes. Montesquieu, Maine, René David, and Schweigger-Eckardt, as paradigmatic authors of modern comparative law, understand the dichotomy, this conceptual opposition between the legal barbarian and the subject of rights, in very different ways. So here what we find again is through narrative applied in the field of comparative law, the possibility of finding how identities constructed in part through law have been stable through time, but at the same time, how these identities have changed. That I think is why it is important in the book, and it has some analytical and political traction. The second point that is also related to what Gurpreet mentioned is connected to how should we interact with the dominant narrative, and what are the options? What should we do with this? What alternatives are to this dominant narrative? And I would say that there are three possible options. The first one is, and is the most common one, I would say, both in the global north and the south, is the reproduction and the diffusion of the narrative. Right? In the global south, we have been part of this system of reproduction, as you were saying, right? But it's surprising, right? Why should we reproduce narrative that subordinates us, right? It is truly surprising, and it is very powerful. But I do think that we have internalized this view, and we believe in it, and we have been an essential part, central part in the process of reproduction of narrative. An alternative is to play within the dominant narrative, try to change it from within, right? So we can try to make changes here and there in the dominant narrative, in the conceptual grid that constitutes the dominant narrative, trying to bring different views, bring the views of the South, and try to accommodate the narrative, the dominant narrative, to our needs, to our hopes, and to bring critiques that come. However, this second option has an important limit, that it accepts the premises from which the dominant narrative starts. Right? Now, the third alternative is more radical. The third alternative is, well, we should try to construct a different narrative, right? We should try to construct a new conceptual grid. However, of course, the challenge of this option is the limits of our legal and political imagination. The fact that we think from within the conceptual grid. So try to go outside it, it's very difficult, of course, it's possible. But it demands not only individual efforts, but a collective and long-term effort to try to create a different way of imagining our legal and political world. However, this is, I think, something that we can do. I believe that as part of a political working in some kind of middle ground between the second option and the third option would be possible, right? On the one hand, the modern legal and political conceptual grid has certain elements that can be used in emancipatory ways. Right? And we should be very strategic in choosing what are these options, what are these tools that we can use in different ways to try to transform the grid, the dominant grid, from within. But at the same time, we should try to contribute to creating this alternative grid, right? That with regard to second with regard to the relationship between art and law, Patricia, I agree with what you said. And in my work, what I've been trying to do in the past years is to create a dialogue between art and law, right? And I think that we can imagine this dialogue in different ways. One that I think is useful but not fruitful enough is to try to use art to illustrate legal arguments, right? Be rhetorically useful, but I think that the dialogue could be much more, right? Second option would be to start with the reflection on legal matters by analyzing paintings or sculpture, by analyzing art, right? So this would be the starting point of a more legal and political analysis that would be the center of the piece. I think this is a more fruitful way, but still it has some important limits, right? The art would be still an instrument for law, right? It would be a tool for achieving legal and political aims. The third option is the one that I find more interesting. And this third option is to try to create a dialogue between art and law, one where we try to find what are at the same time the intersections and the tensions between specific pieces of art and specific legal and political art. And that, I think, is what I try to do with the work of Victor Diop, right? Trying to make explicit what are the questions that Diop tries to answer and what are the questions that I try to answer in very different fields and with very different aims. However, what I try to make explicit is that the questions are more or less the same. There are some common ground, there are some intersections between Diop's work and mine. And by asking these questions from an art perspective, we might discover different ways of understanding the legal questions that are my main object of study. And also what I find interesting about this dialogue between art and law and politics is how art can teach us to find some emancipatory aims and some emancipatory paths to follow, right? And how can we learn from art to use law and to use theoretical arguments within the law in these more progressive ways, right? Now, with regard to Martin's comments, I would say, Martin, that perhaps it is important to distinguish between what the book is and what the book should, right? And I think it is important to try to understand what the book tries to achieve and not what the reader would like the book to be. And this, I think, is related to two of your main comments. One is why the book is not normative. Well, it could be, and certainly, I think that the normative aspects of legal work are important. However, the theoretical framework that I choose is one that focuses precisely on the descriptive and the analytical dimensions of legal work and legal academic. One that, in a very clear and precise way, says, well, we have to try to take some distance from the traditional path that legal academics take. That is one constituted by 3 steps. The first one is the descriptive, the second one is critique, and the third one is the normative. So to ask why the book is not normative is precisely not to accept the premise of the book that says, well, what I'm trying to do is descriptive and analytical, and this is connected to the cultural analysis of law that has this starts from these premises. Of course, we can disagree with the premises, but that is different, right? Because if I include the normative dimension, I will it myself. The same happens, I would say, with your comment about why the book is not inductive. Well, it's not a social sciences book, right? And you are an anthropologist, And with good reasons, you emphasize on the inductive and on empirical and field work. This is not a book about, about issues that are important for the social sciences. It's a book about comparative law, and it's a book that uses legal theory and political theory to think about some issues related to comparative law. Right? So it's not an ethnographic book. It's not a book that would benefit from field work, right? It will be something completely different, perhaps very interesting, but a different book. The third point is also related to why I don't include, particularly in the last part of the book, some authors. I would say that most of the authors that you mentioned are cited in the book. Spivak and Boaventura de Souza and Rajagopal, right? All of them are cited. Of course, they're not cited in depth, and their work is not analyzed. And many would say, well, why didn't you include X or Y? There's always the possibility of including more and more readings and more views. But again, the point is, what is the aim of the last chapter? And the aim of the last chapter is not to present the in-depth analysis of one or other legal view or political view. The aim is to try to find common among very different views that are critical to the dominant narrative created by comparative law. And what I try to do is to choose as many paradigmatic authors of this counter narrative to show that there is some common ground, despite the very many differences that you find among the work of these critical activists. Right? Finally, the last point that you made, I think it's a point that, of course, is important for you because you're an anthropologist, but it's truly in the introduction of the book that is not central to any argument of the book. That is an analogy between anthropology and dominant anthropology and dominant comparative law. And I would say, well, I think it's a peaceful argument to say that dominant comparative law has been central for the creation of the other, and that this process of creation of the other has been problematic because it has created a very good relationship between Europeans and non-Europeans, the global north and the global south, however you would like to structure the argument. And I would say that the same can be said, and it's a peaceful, well-known argument about the dominant anthropology. Of course, there are within anthropology and within comparative law critical views. But again, the aim of the book is not to offer an account of an in-depth account of each critical view. The aim of the book is to try to offer a genealogy of modern comparative law, right? Of the dominant views of comparative. And in an explicit way, I mentioned these in the introduction. I know that in each period, there are critics that question this view, but what I'm trying to do is not offer some kind of traditional historical analysis that shows this key elements of a specific era or a specific period. What I say in the introduction in a very explicit way is I'm choosing this paradigmatic case approach. And I also say in a very explicit way that this obscures the heterogeneity of a field that is profoundly heterogeneous. But although I recognize limits, I think that it is important to focus on the dominant narrative. And perhaps in your discipline, well, all these things have been said already. Perhaps in comparative law and law, well, these are issues that should be explored in more depth. And I would say in comparative law and in general in the legal domain, we have very few genealogical accounts of the dominant narrative. And that is what I think is the main, what I aspire to be the main contribution of the book. Is the cultural analysis a contribution to the book? No, I don't think that. I don't think that the main theoretical tools that I present in the introduction are new or original. I didn't say that. I don't think that they are. What I think is useful is to use, and a contribution is the use of some of these conceptual tools to think about modern comparative law and how modern comparative law is connected to modern law and to the processes of identity construction. That, I think, is the main contribution of the book. One that I think you didn't touch in your comments. Finally, perhaps something that I would like to finish my comments, if I still have time, Gabriela. Am I on time?
A couple of minutes.
No, so I'll stop here. I'm sorry. All right, thank you. Great. So, Gabriela.
Great. Yes, Daniel. So maybe we have only 10 minutes left. I have not received any questions through the chat. I will remind everyone in the public that you can send your questions there. I am even checking the chat on the live in Facebook, so you can also send your questions there. But I think we could maybe use this little time we have left to open a space for a reply in the panelists. Maybe if you want to give continue this dialogue, I think it would be very productive. Maybe we can have 2 minutes, a very brief 2 minutes for each panelist, and we could start maybe this time the other way around. So we will start with you, Professor Gurpreet.
Thank you. You know, when I was listening to you, Daniel, I think I was thinking that perhaps this is one of the elements about the narrative, that when one writes and reflects on one's own life, for instance, one doesn't put in each and every element of one's life there. There are sort of key things that strike out, which you think have shaped you or have been significant for you. And I think this is one of the advantages of the narrative mode of inquiry and presentation, that it allows you to do that. While there may be others, and makes you think that perhaps these were some definitive things without needing to say that this is something that requires, you know, further, well, so many people supported it and so many people didn't. I also thought that perhaps the other thing that came to my mind really is that perhaps we are making too much of disciplinary differences. Because Martin, you would surely agree that even social anthropologists, you know, when they go to the field, they're looking and seeing things, they're actually also using concepts through which they are presenting those observations. And in some way, one can have a study of this kind that, for instance, Daniel has undertaken, of looking at texts and seeing what kind of conceptual vocabularies are they giving us, and making us alert to, with which I can in future then engage with the field I'm talking about. If I'm alert personally, I'm thinking that if I'm alert about the ways in which hierarchies are being constructed, even in stories of diversity, I can then use that becomes a frame of reference, even when I now look at experiences of people or my own experiences. So I thought maybe there is the possibility of thinking of that, because I think some of these elements have been common concerns for most of these disciplines. So at this time, I think my 2 minutes are over, so I should stop here. If there is time, there is another question I want to ask, but if there is time later. Thank you, Gabriela.
So Professor Gurpreet. We will go on with you, Professor Patricia.
Yes, I was also thinking about narrative, as we all seem to go on about this in different ways. And I actually, tend to agree that it's what was striking to me also about Daniel, your proposal in general, beyond art and the discussion with other disciplines, is how this framework really illuminates ways of thinking about our own selves in these sort of dynamics that we are in now, which is why I brought in the final examples and how hard it is to get away from these structures. That also, I kept, when I was reading the book, I kept thinking, can we not get away from this sort of binary mode? And it seems that it's very deeply ingrained. So when you were going, through the various approaches or possibilities, even of constructing a new narrative, it's very difficult. Which again, going back to our local example, how beyond, academic specialized circles, that sort of mythology is everywhere around us. And it has to do, I think, a bit with this sort of opposing continuous way of, also producing that narrative in the media, and so it's very hard to get away from that, us versus them, who is speaking, how this, global north perspective, even if we're simplifying it, seems to be deeply ingrained within, our own post-colonial society. So that really struck me. And I found it, again, very, very illuminating in terms of thinking about what we're living through, but also how the images that surround us are contributing to this narrative, or are contributing to create alternative narratives, which I think is what we're also seeing around us. And like I said, I think we agree on the dialogue between art and law. In fact, what I really liked is that you use your images in the book as arguments, not as illustration. I think that that's something that could really be, worked on in future projects, just analyzing specific cases where we see, the cases rethinking, let's say, the big framework where we seem to be sort of immersed, even on an unconscious level. So I thought images can be useful in that sense, to break that, very set mold that it seems to be so hard to get away from.
Thank you, Professor Zalamea. And finally, Professor Martin, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think there's a misunderstanding, Daniel. I said I agree with the content and also with the perspective. I do not criticize that you use narrative, but I think it's one can go further than that. For instance, I also appreciated, which I didn't say that's true in the beginning, that I really liked your reference to art, and in your explanation, I really also cherish what you said, that one could explore commonalities, or one could even learn from art for changing or for understanding law in society. Yes, I think it would be wonderful to see how visual codes create identity, and how in the examples presented by Patricia, it was really very clear, and also what you presented in your book, how the codes can be broken and can be reassembled, and new ways of statements can be formulated through visual expressions. I think that is a fascinating thing. I also didn't want you to be normative. I think what I wanted to push you a little bit more strongly towards is a stronger dialogue with what is already out there. But I agree, and I agree that your book is very important, particularly for the audience in the field. That's no doubt. I just wanted to present some inroads to stronger dialogue, really, and particularly also with, yes, narratology is of course well established, and the merits are there. That's clearly, that doesn't need to be argued. And you've done it very brilliantly. I just wanted to push you to also other aspects, and I think art is the way you want to work and to continue to work with art. I think it's very fascinating. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Martin. So Professor Bonilla, maybe we can have a very short 2 minutes for a counter reply.
Thank you, Gabriela. Yes, has 2 points. One is I believe strongly what Gurpreet mentioned about the connections in general and in the book, in the personal and the political. So this is a book written because of some personal academic experiences, right? That's the source, the main cause, right? Of course, it's different to make explicit the cause and to think about analytical, political, normative elements of the argument. But the whole idea of thinking about the legal barbarian started by my experiences first as a Global South law professor, right? And interacting with the literature mainly written by Global North professors, and how we used this literature in our law schools and in our universities, and how we didn't have strong literature to compete with these Global North perspectives, and how we internalized and accepted. I mean, this is also connected to something else that Gurpreet mentioned, the subordinated role that this literature made us play. Then the second moment in this personal process was when I had the opportunity to visit, to study in a Global North university. So I was a Global South PhD student, and I experienced in very strong ways this distinction, this dichotomy between the legal barbarian and the legal subject. And in very many daily ways, I experienced how Latin America and in general the Global South was not considered as a rich context for the production of legal knowledge, and how we students from the Global South in this context were considered as marginal in the academic dialogue about the law in this paradigmatic Global North institution. The third step was when I worked as a visiting professor in different universities in the US and in Europe, where I experienced the same dichotomy, the conceptual opposition of the legal barbarian and the subject of rights in similar but different ways, right? And what I started to do was not only to reflect about my own experience and my interactions with people that were very serious, very committed, with work that was excellent, but at the same time, continuously were legitimizing the products of the Global South and the people from the Global South from an epistemological perspective. So I tried to reflect about this with, going hand in hand with the reflections, the critical reflections that were already there outside, right? And then I worked in a couple of pieces about clinical work from a clinical perspective and a Global North, Global South perspective, and then trying to think in more wide things about these issues from the perspective of what I call the political economy. And through this path, I ended reflecting about comparative law. And I wasn't a comparativist when I went to the US. I was a person that worked on constitutional law and legal theory. But when I went there, the universities that I visited asked me to teach comparative law simply because I was from abroad, as a foreigner. Right? So I started reading all these materials for my classes. And I started to realize that this was one of the key sources, this literature was one of the key sources of this opposition between the legal barbarian and the subject of rights, and how this literature was had and was permeating the interactions between the legal communities of both the global north and the global south. That's now in a very short way the story of how I got engaged in writing this book. I'm sorry, Gabriela. I'll try.
Don't worry, Professor Bonilla. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists and Professor Bonilla for this wonderful dialogue and conversation that we had in this panel. We have taken up a little bit from the next panel, but then I leave the space for our next moderator, which is Olga Cabeza, and we can give way to the second panel of this book launch event. So thank you very much, and remember to send your questions in the chat. We will continue reading them here.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you, I'm sorry. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second part of this launch event. It is an honor for me to present you the second panel entitled The Genealogy of Modern Comparative Law and the Legal Barbarian, Dominant Narrative and Counter-Narrative. My name is Olga Cabeza, and I will be the moderator of this panel. In the first panel, we talk about identities and narratives. Now, this second panel, we will discuss in a wider way of the genealogy of the modern comparative law offered by Professor Bonilla in Legal Barbarian. This genealogy is made up of three key moments, as you already know. These three key moments are comparative instrumental studies, comparative legislative studies, and comparative law as an autonomous discipline. In all of this moment, modern comparative law creates individuals and collective identities, as well as particulars understanding of history and conceptual geographies. All of these elements rest on the conceptual opposition of the legal subject and the legal barbarian. In addition, the book offers an overview of theoretical perspective that challenge this dominant narrative created by modern comparative law. These theoretical perspectives are third-world approaches to international law, post-colonial law studies, and critical comparative law. So we are going to continue with the dynamic initiated by Gabriela. So the panelists will have 15 minutes each for the presentations. When there are 2 minutes left, I'm going to show you this piece of paper. And after the presentation, Professor Bonilla will react to the comments, questions and critiques offered by the panelists. At the end of the panel, Professor Bonilla and the panelists will respond and react to questions and comments from the audience, from the public. So please, the question and comments will be made in the chat, please. So it could be in English or in Spanish. Well, now I'm going to introduce you the panelists. Thank you all for accepting this invitation, and we are very, very proud of having you here. I'm going to start with Francisca Pou. Francisca is a professor of constitutional law at Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM. She holds a master and a PhD from Yale University, and she obtained a law degree at the Pompeu Fabra University of Barcelona. Her research work focuses on topics such as constitutional reform and other forms of constitutional change, the comparative analysis of Mexican constitutionalism, and the protection of rights, especially the rights related to anti-discrimination law and gender issues. Our second panelist is Liliana Obregón. Liliana is a professor of law and the director of the LLM and International Law at the Universidad de los Andes here in Bogotá. She has a degree in law from the same university, an MA from the School of Advanced International Studies of the Johns Hopkins University, and a doctoral degree in law from Harvard University. The research work of Professor Obregón is related to international legal history and historiography, ideologies of historical narratives, global and transnational intellectual history with particular interest in peripheral histories, colonialism, and forgotten actors and events of 19th and 20th century Americas and Europe. Finally, we're going to have Professor David Lando. Professor Lando is the Mason Ladd Professor at Florida State University, where he teaches constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, and public international law. He holds a PhD in political science, a JD and an AB from Harvard University, and his research interests rest in constitutional theory, constitutional design, and comparative constitutional law. We are going to start with Professor Lando, as the agenda says. So thank you very much, Professor Lando.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Daniel, for the invitation to be here to read and engage with your fabulous book, which I think has huge, really significant implications for the way we think about and do comparative constitutional law, in a few different senses, right? I think one is for someone like me who kind of practices comparative law without really thinking a lot about exactly what it is that I'm doing, right? Which I think is pretty common actually among comparativists, sort of start doing stuff, but don't always think that much about like what the underlying nature of the enterprise is. I think that the kind of historical genealogy of kind of critical historical genealogy of the field that you provide is extremely useful for kind of making us think harder, right, about what it is we're doing and what the categories are that we're using, kind of almost subconsciously or automatically when we engage with the work. The second point, I want to make is I think the book is really impressive and kind of fascinating in centralizing comparative law within law, right? Because I think, as you point out in the book, it's normally thought of as a relatively marginal discipline, kind of oddly, right? This is particularly true in the U.S. To my frustration, where you're sort of treated as, on the periphery of law, you're doing something relatively unimportant. And yet I think what you show is it is, in fact, this is where a lot of the central categories or conceptions of identity are actually built, right? So it actually is central, I think, to the field, and I think in that way does a really good job of suggesting the deep problems at the core of not just comparative law, but the way we engage with law more broadly. And then I think thirdly, a lot of what is suggested as a response or amelioration of the problems you point out, I think is very persuasive to me. So the problematizing the ideas of legal families and legal transplants as categories that we work with all the time, and yet are deeply problematic. Another one, the idea of hybridization or hybrids, right, or combinations of legal families, which, so Siska and I had a bit of an exchange last week on a paper. She has a wonderful paper on legal hybrids, and the idea of legal hybrids being central to the way law is discussed and thought about in Latin America, which is kind of built, I think, interestingly, and I think this goes to one of your core points, Daniel, not just to the external vision, sort of the way the outsiders see Latin American law, but in fact, in an interesting way, the self-perception, right, is built on, well, these are hybrid models, and related to that, a kind of normative assessment that's not good, generally speaking, right? So it becomes, one can trace a story in which hybridization is linked to constitutional failure, or perceived constitutional failure throughout the region. And yet, I think, as you show or suggest, right, that response is itself deeply problematic, right? There's at least as much reason to think what is identified as hybridization would be a source of strength, right? Would be generative, for example, of new ideas or concepts. And so the way these categories not only get constructed, but also gain a kind of normative resonance that isn't deeply thought about, but is very problematic, I think is really interesting, right? And very important. Where I want to focus a couple of my comments in the time I have is on a couple of points where I think what I pick up, again, is kind of practicing, particularly kind of public law comparativism, is like, well, what do we do, right? So I take every point you make in the book, I think, is essentially correct, right, and important. The history of the field you trace is important, and I think right in many ways. And I wonder, what's the response? I think a lot of what you put in the last chapter that is a kind of the critical impulse as a response, right? In other words, you unmask or uncover the kinds of discourses that make up the hegemonic model of comparative law, and sort of unmask them, show that they are problematic, come up with counter narratives. And I think that is right? I think some of these just come out of my own work, right? I think another way that I would respond is with a kind of, what I would suggest is sort of shored up or improved functionalism in a sense, right? In other words, what I wonder is there a problem with, is the problem functionalism, which I think is the core of comparative law in a lot of ways, right? Or is it, as Daniel says at a few points in the book, is it more is it bad functionalism, basically, right? The problem is not functionalism, but the way it's been done. And I think what I would suggest is that you can come up with a much more robust, kind of more careful, more sort of comprehensive version of functionalism that, if it doesn't avoid these problems entirely, at least does a better job of dealing with them. And here I think, what one sees is, again, comparative law, as we know, right? Borrowing is inevitable, occurs all the time. Almost everything within the field is kind of generated off of something else from somewhere else at some point, right? But what has traditionally been focused on are kind of north-south lines, right, of transmission. I think there's some really good work showing how complex those lines of transmission are, right? I'm thinking of works like Diego Lopez's stuff on Teoría Empírica de Derecho, right, which suggests the way that ideas get transmuted or changed in the very process of transmission. Then I think, something that is interesting and important is that there is a very large amount of south-south transmission, right, as well, that's extremely important. So you have doctrines, concepts, or ideas that move in a way that's from one global South context to another. And you have this conception of kind of leading jurisdictions, right, within the global South. I'm thinking of Daniel's book from 7 or 8 years ago of kind of the jurisprudence of the global South, right? And these kind of leading jurisdictions that you have of places like India and Colombia that are themselves, yes, that are themselves producers of jurisprudence within the region. I think obviously those lines of transmission are extremely important, I think, to understand and kind of interesting, right? Both kind of clearly very important, but maybe normatively problematic in a certain way, right? Something that I think needs more exploration. Then finally, you have the idea, I think, of south-north transmission, right? In other words, reversing what one would call the ordinary lines of transmission. And I think it's interesting, as Daniel suggests in the book, that this is traditionally conceptualized as almost invisible, right, in the field, like it doesn't exist, but it does exist. And I think maybe more importantly, like from a normative perspective, these influences need to exist and should exist in the following sense. I think as a functionalist, which is how I would self-identify, right, it is important to foreground how many of the central constitutional law concepts and ideas are now being generated and constructed within global South context, right, across a number of different areas. This is true in rights, right? Areas like socioeconomic rights, where the engagement, generally speaking, has been much richer and more serious, right, within regions like Latin America than it has in the global north. It's true, I think, of environmental rights in many ways. It's true of indigenous rights, right, or sort of structures of governance that deal seriously with indigenous peoples. It's true, I think, in certain respects about ideas about popular participation. And it is true about key issues in the structure of government, the design of new branches or institution of government to respond to various kinds of democratic distrust or failure, right? The construction of new institutions. You know, and here I kind of think of, you can think of like, you know, Mark Tushnet's ongoing project about independent accountability institutions, kind of trying to centralize those. And the kind of baseline model, I think, for Tushnet is the South African Constitution and the way it deals seriously with independent accountability institutions across a number of different areas, right? Elections, human rights. And I think, of course, you want to broaden that, right? But in many ways, it's true, again, that it is global South context that are dealing, I think, in kind of the most rigorous, serious way with those kinds of problems in the construction of innovative new institutions to deal with them. Secondly, if you think that core functionalism is the dealing with common problems, well, what are those problems, right? I think that many of them, if you look at like recent developments, for example, I'm thinking essentially of the US, right? But in many parts of the global north are problems of democratic distrust and dysfunction, social inequality. These sorts of problems are ones that have been paradigmatically kind of associated with global South context, and yet they are pervasive within the global North. I think there is increasing recognition of that fact. So, and yet again, it is often global South contexts that have dealt most seriously with those sets of problems. In other words, what I would argue as a functionalist is the lines of transmission seriously need to be reversed. I'm not arguing that that's been done yet, right? But I think that there's kind of important projects to be done in that area, and rethinking, for example, the constitutionalism of places like the United States, right? So I think part of what I would call for, I think, is a better, more serious functionalism than has existed in prior comparative law. The second point I want to raise very, very briefly, I think I'm running out of time, is just about the normative standard, in a sense, within the work. So again, I think it's came out in the last panel. It's a descriptive work, and yet it clearly has, I think, significant normative implications for the way we do or think about comparative law. So the idea is, you know, if you think one of the problems in the field is a kind of almost a set of assumptions about what the right model of constitutionalism is that's sort of automatic, right, and gets kind of imposed, then I think the question is, what's the response? One would be to kind of do without one at all and just kind of catalog what exists right around the world, and sort of give it weight. I think it's very difficult do that within law, interestingly, right? It's quite hard. Then the question I think may become like, what could serve as a standard? And what is kind of contestable? How should we think about like what model should look like? And I think there's kind of a crisis of liberal democratic constitutionalism in the sense that on the one hand, the model, interestingly, is kind of hegemonic in the sense that everyone borrows the grammar and vocabulary. And this is true to the extent that it's almost been emptied of content, right? Like hybrid and authoritarian actors also borrow the grammar and the vocabulary and use it. And the book that Roz Dixon and I are just finishing called Abusive Constitutional Borrowing is basically just shows how easy this is to do, right? You can take liberal democratic forms, rework them, make them into authoritarian instruments surprisingly easily, I think. And so on the one hand, there's a kind of mimicry, which is masking a deep crisis, I think, on the nature of liberal democratic constitutionalism. Raz and I say in the book, essentially, like, what is abusive? To us, abusive is the use of essentially something associated with democratic constitutionalism for an anti-democratic end, right? Using a relatively narrow sort of electoral yardstick of democracy. So using kind of a relatively narrow conception of democracy, which among other things may help to build consensus, right, about what really kind of should be there. That's what we define as abuse. And then I think the interesting question would be, would we gain something by making everything contestable, everything outside of that core contestable, right? So should you even make commitments to liberalism essentially contestable or open to negotiation? I wonder a lot, and I'm not trying to provide responses because I really don't know, right? But I wonder a lot about kind of what gets held on to once you take that, once you take Daniel's critique, I think, seriously, right? And I guess what I would suggest is, if you do identify and agree with the idea that liberal democratic constitutionalism is experiencing a serious crisis, that it, partly because it's not serving a number of key goals that well, right? Then I think you are at a point where what you want to do is encourage a lot more experimentation with constitutional form. And yet a lot of the experiments that we've seen, right, normatively from my perspective, have bad outcomes, and I am partly thinking of the Bolivarian constitutionalism in the Andes, right, where I think you see often problematic results. So I think this core question of like what ought to be contestable, what should we be experimenting with is kind of a core one at the center of comparative public law. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Lando. So the next presentation will be Francisca Poe.
Thanks, Olga. Thanks, Daniel, the editors, the university, the organizers, for inviting me. And it's a pleasure really to share the panel with David and Liliana. And it's been a pleasure to read this book, Daniel, from which I have learned as much as always when I read what you do. I think it's extremely well structured. It's clear, it's very elegantly argued. And it has produced all the effects that a good academic work generates in terms of, illuminating elements that maybe I had the intuition, but I was really missing, generating questions and generally feeding intellectual curiosity. In a way, as the book actually remarks, I think what we have here is a continuation of Daniel's previous work, right? Which is centered in general terms in uncovering and denouncing what he calls the political economy of legal knowledge, the map of power asymmetries that pervade our conceptual and institutional spaces of legal imagination and action. But this time there is a very specific focus, right? Comparative law. So Daniel reconstructs the genealogy of comparative law by exploring 3 paradigmatic episodes, one from the 18th century, another one from the 19th century, and another one from the 20th century, anchored to different individuals and intellectual interventions, right? Montesquieu and his geographic determinism, or at least inertialism, Henry Maine and his narrative of progress, and the triplet of comparatist professors, René David and Konrad Zweigert and Hein Kutz, whose contribution revolves around taxonomies, legal families, and functionalist projects of legal harmonization and rationalization. And Daniel very elegantly postulates that these individuals and these historic episodes put 3 different elements at the center of their proposals of explanation, right? Space, time, and the subject. But common and transversal to all is always the same opposition, the same basic asymmetric framework, the opposition between the legal subject and the barbarian, recreated through a spiral of other mirror replicating oppositions, right? So I think comparative law is masterfully portrayed by Daniel in this book as an exercise of what Rivers Siegel would call preservation through transformation, in a way. And of course, the chapter on comparative law as an autonomous discipline articulates the exercise with another one dedicated to the counter-narratives, which describes spaces of resistance and focuses on the phenomenon of the practitioners of critical comparativism, in whose ranks Daniel situates third-world approaches to international law, critical comparativists, stricto sensu, and post-colonial studies. There are many things to be said about the particular thesis that the book substantiates, but for the purpose of the debate, I will just make 2 general comments and maybe formulate 1 or 2 questions for Daniel in the end. Some of the comments very much in line with what David has just expressed. My first comment is not so much about what the book does, which is of course quite a lot, but about what the book empowers us to do next, right? I mean, in the book, comparative law as a discipline is offered, I think, as a paradigm, right? As a miniature. But what is really powerful is what you can do next under the analytical lenses that the book bestows on us outside comparative law. Comparative law, I think this is in the end very convincing, is a sort of, you know, thematic park, a sort of little Disneyland of asymmetries. I mean, I don't want to say it too superficially, but in this sense, it's a paradigm, right? Because it's so very, I don't know, deep and marked and expressed there. But at least I thought when I read your book, Daniel, there is a sort of naive quality, transparency in comparative law that maybe makes it less problematic that other, you know, that the asymmetries that we find in other subjects, where you don't have this explicitly dual or plural structure, because, you know, in comparative law, as you have to tell differences and analogies, at least the other, you know, is explicitly on the map, right? And of course, it is all very asymmetric, but at least I don't know, I think there's a transparency that makes it in a way like more, I don't know, less dangerous in a sense, in the sense that is more sincere. It's true, of course, that historically, as you explained, the whole thing was covered by the, you know, by transversal ideas that rationalize the asymmetries, progress, or more recently, the objective language of functionalism. But, you know, one, you give us the tools you give us for everyone who wants to see the elements are there, right? Some systems have been called systems and other religions. Some have been studied for hundreds of pages and others only for a few dozens. And some have been called parent systems, and others have been called child systems. So this is probably the reason why comparative law, as your book observes, is relatively marginal today, right? Because at the bottom of it, we know that to demarginalize comparative law, it needs to be completely remade, right? I mean, it won't do the trick anymore as we have inherited it, right? But I think to me that we are keeping also comparative law at the margins, not only because of this reason, because of the so much work that needs to be done, but rather because we are already immersed in the next episode of the iteration, the episode of the 21st century, that I see singularized as the emergence of the "we are all comparativists now" phenomenon, right? So we don't need comparative law anymore. So while René David and the Germans struggled to beat the global law by unification around or harmonization, at least around parameters that were of course deeply Western, in our time, the greater mobility of people and of academic knowledge has created the illusion that we are all already global. You know, that legal disciplines have been already effectively transformed. The illusion that comparison has been mainstreamed in a technical sense into the various substantive disciplines. This is what I thought while reading. We shouldn't find comfort in the relative marginalization of comparative law, of problematic pedigree, because comparison has migrated somewhere else. It has been mainstreamed into the other disciplines. And these other disciplines are not marginal. Global investment law is not marginal. Global public law is not marginal. Comparative constitutional studies is not particularly marginal. You know, thanks to, as David said, thanks to the abundance of constitution-making episodes we have witnessed over the last decades with the last wave of democratization, comparative constitutional design is not marginal as a discipline. Thanks to the expansion of courts, the use of comparative arguments by the judiciary with the accompanying talk of judicial dialogue is not marginal. Moreover, as we had the occasion to explore last week in this seminar that David mentioned, and where Daniel was also present for some time, we are currently experiencing an upsurge in constitutional taxonomy, right? Because of the adoption of the constitutional form in the most varied array of regimes, some of them illiberal, some of them authoritarian. So, of course, as in the past, there are elements that apparently ground methodologically what is done within the confines of these non-marginal disciplines, which generally self-understand themselves as interdisciplinary, progressive, inclusive in being more global than, you know, before, and basically non-ideological and good faith inspired, I would say, by commendable goals. But because we now have read Legal Barbarians by Bonilla, we know that it is all probably, again, at least in some form, under a form of new rationalization and objectifications, right? I mean, the book gives us the tool to have this presumption. So, and this is, I think, the most powerful gift of this book, that invites and even makes urgent the address of a gigantic agenda outside comparative law, right? With the challenge of not throwing the baby with the bathwater, because there's probably also something empowering in building something globally, right? In not going to the other extreme. So this is my first big comment, the thing that it struck me most with the reading, after the reading. The second comment is far shorter. The book made me think a lot about the specificity of the legal domain, or not, but mainly my intuition is that yes, that there's something specific in the comparative legal matters that make asymmetries more, or a bit deeper, or a bit more marked than in other social sciences, like, for instance, comparative politics. I don't know why. Comparative politics, I see academic interactions as much more horizontal, you know, much more like global in a real sense, let alone compared to other disciplines and social sciences. And you say this in the book, right? Math, engineering, technology, where you know the North is not particularly powerful in the production of knowledge. And two preliminary explanations come to mind that I want to, like to put in the dialogue. The first one is, of course, it might be we all know the special relation that law and jurists have with political power, right? I mean, there must be a greater investment in legal categories because of the connection with discourses of real political power, But the second one is cognitive, in a sense. And it might have to do with the context dependence and the detail dependence of law and of comparative law in particular. To be a comparatist in law, you need to know an amount of details that is simply overwhelming. You need to learn a lot about positive law of other places and much more beyond positive law. I mean, to be a comparatist in legal studies is not a fast career, it's slow food, really. So if you have a position of relative epistemological and political power, I think you have a strong incentive in insisting that the conversation remains close to what you already understand. This is to say, your own positive law, the positive law of the global North. So you have, I think, maybe we have all a cognitive investment in a system in whose context what is not written in English or French does not exist, because it makes things far more simpler, far more manageable. This is why we are all obliged to discuss papers, for instance, about US law, and the implicit understanding that we know everything about American law, and if we don't know, then we are not sufficiently good professional academics. And this is why if we happen to write a paper about the Global South, we are, on the contrary, we have to provide a lot of background, appropriate background about the legal systems. We are trying to, we are not allowed to assume people out there know something about the law of the Global South. So finally, and Olga, I am really finishing. I had two questions, I think, that have, the second one is already been on the table, but anyway, the two questions are about critical theories and the place of the critical intellectual, right? Which has come up also in the first panel. I think this really touches us all around the book. I wanted to invite you to clarify a little bit, Daniel, how do you see the relation between critical comparative law and other strands of critical theory, right? Critical legal studies focusing mainly on legal theory, critical race theory, the different strands of critical feminism. How should the critical intellectual position herself before the intersectionality of grounds of disadvantage and domination in the political what should be today the scope of the critical intellectual? Does it make sense to become a specialized critical scholar by discipline? You know what I mean? Does it make sense to be a critical comparativist or should we promote the emergence of generalist critics, right? That have into account, gender asymmetries, the asymmetries you focus on this book, but also, all the asymmetries that we know that are at the same time operating. Would this be productive, or it would rather diminish a lot the potency of critical theory? That is a very genuine question. I don't know a lot about critical theory, and I thought all the time this, how must be the scope of the critical scholar. The other question does not have to do with the scope, but with the spectrum of possible attitudes. And you already said something in responding to the first panelist, and David also said something about this. And so there's a spectrum of possible attitudes, right? To assimilate, just to reproduce, as you say, you know, to become an assimilated, I don't know, global North scholar, and then you say as a second, or play within the narrative and try to, but in the book, you say that mainly what critical scholars can do is resistance, you know, more than transformation. Even if now, and I think the panelists in the previous table also explore this, how to advance towards something more, right? Which is very difficult to think about. How to become more transformative, how to become what in feminist debates we often call a radical insider, right? Or yes, or maybe building something else, but as you know, Patricia Zalamea said, and others, and you also said, this is very difficult, no? But probably, I mean, the debate about the space between the second position and the third position, right, is what has captured our interest, the interest of all that have read your book, right? But yes, that is probably a collective project. And I agree that, you know, this really identifies a direction of future work, not only for you, Daniel, but for many of us, you know, which conceive of us as intermediate hybrid kind of scholars that are maybe on the second position, but maybe would like to be more in the third, both in the North and in the South, right? So these are my comments and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Paul, for these provocative questions. So we're going to continue with Liliana Obregón.
Hi, you see me? Yes, and hear me? Okay,
Yes.
So thank you once again for inviting me to this wonderful conversation and to be able to explore Daniel's very rich and provocative book from different angles, which we've already seen in just in a few hours how many points of discussion and interaction that we all have with this book, coming from our own disciplines and our own research and past work. So this is I'm very grateful for this discussion. So the way that I entered Daniel's book, of course, from my own field of work in international legal history, actually, I think Daniel brought back many memories and many connections because of the way that some of these topics in international legal history or international law, critical international law, let's say, has been going on for quite a while. So the first moment that I encountered this idea of the civilized and the barbarians in law was actually through a footnote from Anthony Angie's future book, which at that time was you know, just some articles and some drafts. And he had a footnote. Well, he does discuss the idea of civilization, the civilized, and he had a footnote that he would not address the Americas because it wasn't, he was more going into, though he has an article on Victoria, he was going more into the 20th century and the structure of colonialism in international law, but more in the end of the 19th and then the beginning of the 20th century. So so this idea of how the concept of the civilized and the barbarian in international legal thought or history from Latin America was really what brought me to begin practically my academic career in that area. And what I wanted to go through was the different moments that I have also gone, that are the moments that Daniel has structured in his book, like the 18th and 19th and 20th century through his authors that represent the construction of the legal barbarian in these different moments. And the connection that I saw I mean, I think the way that I would put it is that Daniel the book is rich for what is in there, what he leaves us to continue further reading or to make further connections, but also what could not be there because he can't write about everything, but is in there in perhaps in silence or in a further conversation. And I think one main point that I've been thinking about throughout this conversation is also the legal barbarians that are created in the global South or in our own traditions as well. So let me see. My thoughts are a little bit disorganized, but I think that the first part is to say that I think there's one part of that we must acknowledge, that even in colonial settings, and I'll refer mainly to the Americas because it's what I know best, but even in the colonial settings, there was always a challenge inside of the legal system to perhaps the colonial or European structures that were in place. So, for example, in the colonial period of Spanish America, we have the Derecho Indiano and the Derecho Criollo, which was a special law for the Indies, for the Spanish American colonies, but at the same time it was also in a process of construction and challenged from indigenous people and from slaves that often would request their freedom through the legal system, no, in many cases. So there's a very interesting relatively new work on showing how even in the colonial period both indigenous and free blacks as well as slaves would use the legal system and contribute to its creation of something, something different that was of the Americas that we could call Creole, right? And this is, the notion of the Creole legal consciousness that I've been, that I worked in my dissertation and then in several articles that came after. So I see sometimes Daniel as one of these modern Creoles, no? He's borrowing from or taking from Europe or criticizing the Europeans, but at the same time making something new and different. And that is a very, very Creole move, right? To take and borrow from others, critique it, and then make something completely new out of it. Even though the places from which he borrows are evident and are present, and it's part of the book. So going back to the chronological or the historical moments that Daniel has in his book, he doesn't have the colonial era, but I just wanted to make that point that in that colonial era, while there was a whole caste construction, a legal system based on a caste hierarchy of castes, which people were put into place in legal, economic, and social terms, and the Creoles were at the top of that caste system and were the ones that were able to contest the law, but also be part of it at the same time, and be part of the Spanish colonial system. But when Daniel enters in the 18th century, and this is the moment, of humanism, and the questioning of this, what Reinhard Koselleck would call the apocalyptic view of the future, where in the colonial era or before the 18th century humanist move, the idea of destiny and that we were all destined to a final future, that we were all destined into certain roles because of God's will. This questioning of God's will and of a predetermined future is really what revolutionizes all of the fields of thought in the 18th century and the 19th century. And this possibility of constructing a future and of progress based on human rationality is really definitive. And of course, Montesquieu is at that groundbreaking moment in the 18th century. But what I also, and again, this is what is not in the text, but I think it would be, or we have to add to it and to recontextualize historically that even in Montesquieu's, Parisian milieu of intellectual debate, there was a lot of contestation on, the spirit of the law and the debates over history. And at the same time, we have the colony of Haiti, which is in the background of Montesquieu's work, and then the Haitian Revolution in the end of the 18th century, where the Haitian Revolution is contesting precisely this whole structure by making the Black slaves part of a new colony, or a new state, and contesting the whole structure of even the rights of man from the French Revolution. So the idea of who is man and we are men too is part of the Haitian Revolution's constitution, Haitian Revolution experiment, I guess, or a very dramatic process. But in the 1805 Haitian Constitution, the first constitution, they flip the civilized barbarian dichotomy on its head and say, in the Constitution, who are the civilized now and who are the barbarians, right? And so they use the same language of the colonizer or the oppressor to show it back at them in this very interesting constitution of 1805. Of course, that is a history that was forgotten for many years on purpose. Like the silencing of Haiti is a common trope in Haitian studies. But I think it's important to show that, again, these are the barbarians of Montesquieu, throwing it back at them and making a state, of course, in the structure of what would be a European republic at that time. But I think it's one important moment not to forget that there is this contestation in the Americas very early on. And then we have the 19th century with Maine, which in international legal history, there's also a lot going on in the Americas to contest the type of international law that is imposed in the region, especially for the Latin American states to be able to claim that they are as civilized as the European states, and their independence should be recognized, of course, except for Haiti, right? Like they want their independence recognized, but not Haiti, because they don't want Haitis in their own region. So even Simon Bolivar says that, like, despite that the Haitians helped Simon Bolivar in his independence cause with everything from boats, money, to a printing press and men, Bolivar was recognized that he owed the independence to President Pétion of Haiti, but then said, we don't want Haitis in our region, because most of them were slave owners at that time. So, but at the same time, these Latin American Creole elites also contest the image of them as being barbarians to the Europeans. And in the end, I don't really think, and this is interesting to the way that Daniel cites me in the last chapter. They never felt like peripheral or marginal from, they felt that they were constructing international law from the Americas, but not even as a periphery. I think Carlos Calvo was the one that said, we have to make our particular universal. So of course, I'm referring to these very sophisticated elites, men, all of them, and that were educated mainly in Europe as well. But they were also trying to contest and use, but by being at the center at the same time. They did not want to be peripheral at all, and they didn't feel that they were peripheral. And so I think the end of the 19th century is also important to remember the Berlin Conference and how that fits into a new colonization of Africa, in which even someone like Carlos Calvo participates to help Portugal colonize an area of Africa. And so he sees that as perfectly acceptable to help colonize Africa, but wants the independence of the Americas to be protected and to be accepted as that. And then in the last, and I see my time is running up or run out. The last part of the 20th century, I think it's also important to show that at least in international law, we see the 20th century, and maybe my colleague Arnulf Becker has said that more appropriately with his book on Mestizo international law, that in the second half of the 20th century, from, we go from 51 founding members to nearly 200 in the United Nations. This second half of the 20th century is really constructed from, or at least in international law, from participants of states, of the new states throughout the hemisphere, including Latin America. And so this is another moment where the former legal barbarians take over practically, despite the structure. We could, there are many criticisms that we could say of the structure of international law, but the participation of the former barbarians in the formation of an international legal structure is evident in many ways. And so I think, and I have a whole bunch of comments on the footnotes, which I was going to go into, but I think that my time is up. And so I would like to finish with some questions on these issues of how does Daniel see that we could, also contextual or also recall these critical perspectives from our region and from others that have gone way back, like without leaving them to see it as a historical result of oppression and let's say colonialism, but also the way that there has been contestation from the colonial eras ever since, and that we have to also remind us of those and reuse them in contemporary terms. So that's one question, like how can we do that better to adapt to what your political project is? And the second part, and this was part of my footnote, my footnote critique, or not critique, but I found a lot of things in the footnotes that I thought would be interesting to make. But I think that, and this is more of a personal question for Daniel, in terms of your writing and how you feel more creative and more perhaps a little bit more adventurous, I felt is when you use the least footnotes, like in your, when you got into the artistic, comparison, as Patricia was showing so brilliantly, and when you get into that area that seems a little bit uncomfortable for you, like you seem to get out of your zone of comfort, I think it's when you have the most interesting insights, because you're not attached to all of those footnotes that you're making. I mean, you seem more creative. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about that intellectual process for yourself, like that inner reflection on how to be more creative as an author, and to go past and to release the footnotes and become more of an author in that sense. So I guess I should finish there, because I've gone way past my time.
Thank you, Professor Liliana. Professor Bonilla, it's your turn to reply.
Thank you, Olga, and thank you, Liliana, Francisca, and David, for all your comments and questions and critiques. Many interesting issues. I'll try to address as many as I can in the time that I have. So I think that I would like to start. I would like to start with a point that I think cuts across the comments made by the three of you, and it's related to the political aim of the book. So as David was saying, the book is mainly descriptive and analytical, but of course, implicitly, there is a very precise political aim. The book does not claim to be neutral or impartial at all. What I want to do with the book is to, from a political perspective, is to make explicit, raise consciousness about an issue that has been profoundly influential in the way we think about ourselves from a legal perspective, and from for the way we have constructed our individual and collective identities. As Francisca was saying, I think many of us have at some point thought about these issues, right? But because of certain experience that we have had, or because an article or a book that was particularly interesting to us. So the book tries to connect some of the key points of the dominant narrative that have been profoundly influential in the way we think about who we are in the Global South, and how, as legal subjects, and how people in the Global North think about themselves as also legal subjects. So in that sense, the book does not try to offer an alternative view, right? Clearly, it tries to avoid thinking about these issues from a normative perspective. Now, the paradox is, as also David was saying, is that reflecting about these issues is reflecting about field that has been historically in the margins of our legal communities, right? We don't read comparative law. We don't engage deeply with the literature produced by comparativists. However, and here's the paradox, the narratives constructed by comparativists have influenced, have permeated in a very profound way other areas of law, right? So if in Latin America, if someone asks a law student or a law professor if they have read René David or Schweiger and Cox, probably they would say no. I don't even know who these guys are. But ask them about legal families, and ask them about what they think about the Colombian legal system with regard to these legal traditions, and they would clearly have a position on this. Perhaps not a profound, a deep position, but they would know that supposedly Colombia is part of the civil law tradition, and that this makes us who we are from a law perspective, right? So to connect this two points, what I tried to do, what I aspired to do with the book, is to show how comparative law has not been at all marginal in how we think about our legal and political identities, how we think about law in broader, right? So that is why the book aspires. The hope is to make a contribution to critical reflection about comparative law and a critical reflection about how comparative law has influenced other areas of law. It does not aspire to make a contribution to anthropology or to sociology or to legal anthropology. Those are very important and valuable fields, but are different fields, right? That on the one hand. Then this, I think, is connected to David's point about functionalism, right? And I do think, as you were saying, that functionalism has been dominant within comparative law, right? We can identify the dominant discourse, the dominant narrative of modern comparative law with functionalism. But also, as you said, mainly this functionalism, this dominant functionalism, is bad functionalism, right? And it is bad in part because of the premises from where it starts, right? And these premises are connected to, I believe, at least in part, with this conceptual opposition of the legal barbarian and the subject. But also, I think this dominant functionalism is functionalism because historically has been marginally interested in theory and method, right? We comparative law from a functionalist perspective because it's useful. It's obvious that it is useful, and we don't have to think about why it is useful and how should we do it and what are the theoretical frameworks that would foundate what we do, right? And I think that efforts like the ones by Ralph Michaels to reinterpret functionalism are truly valuable and would present functionalism in a different way, in a more useful way. Also thinking that, legal transplants that are particularly for functionalism and solving problems through legal transplant that is of particular interest for functionalism has been a powerful engine for legal and social change, right? And I think it should be like that, and it will be like that. So we should think in more deep ways, in more careful ways, more theoretical ways about function and how to do it better. And this is connected to, I believe, Francisca's and David's point about taxonomies, right? And how taxonomies are connected also to the limits of our political legal imagination and the paths that we should try to walk in order to find different views from the ones offered by the dominant narrative of modern comparative law. And here what I would say is, if we think about liberal democracies, as David was suggesting that we should do, the point would be, well, to try to question the naturalization of a certain type of liberal democracy, right? The idea that in order to have a liberal democracy, we have to have certain types of institutions and only those, and that there is only one path to get to this end, right? To have a consolidated, strong liberal democracy. So a way to think about this from a normative perspective is to promote and to try to make explicit different ways of thinking about democratic liberal polities, right? And how, as a matter of fact, we have a very diverse way of materializing liberal and democratic values, right? Also, from a normative perspective, to push the boundaries, right? How can we move away from traditionally, although diverse ways of thinking about liberal democracies? What other ways of imagining our polities can we, right? And again, here the point is, the big obstacle is that we think about these issues from within the grammar of a modern constitution, right? And therefore, it is difficult to take distance from it and think about alternatives. But as I said before, the issue is that we can, at least partially, take distance from parts of this grammar and try to criticize this grammar and offer, at least a piecemeal transformation of these deep structures of the categories of the greed that we used to think about legal and political age. This, I think, is connected perhaps to another issue that Liliana raised, right? The internal contestation of the dominant narrative. I completely agree with what you said, Liliana, and I think this was a point that was touched by Martin too. And certainly the issue is not that only in the late 20th century and in the 21st century we find counter narratives to the dominant narrative. Of course, I would fully agree with the argument. And I also think that it would be academically valuable and politically valuable to offer a genealogy of these contexts, these counter narratives that we find in the history of comparative. However, the aim of the book was to try to make explicit the dominant narrative, right? And I think that I aspire it to be a contribution because you don't find in the comparative law literature many historical approaches to the field, right? You have an article, a very old article by Haag that is, written in a very traditional way and also using very traditional premises. Perhaps one book that was published a year and a half ago by Veronica Corcotel offers a very interesting and rich genealogical historical analysis of the party. But besides that book, I would say there's very little, right, within comparative law to think about the field from a historical and from a critical. And that is my aspiration, and that is what I would like to contribute. That is my contribution to the making explicit, to the consciousness raising as a political aim. And this, I think, can lead to a reflection about what we might want to call, following Liliana's comments, the internal legal barriers, right? I fully agree too that there is a dichotomy, right? A broad dichotomy between the legal barbarian and the subject rights that follows the global north and global south dichotomy. But the same dominant narrative created by comparative law has been used in the global south to create internal hierarchies. I would say also in the global north, right? I think I mentioned something a little bit about this in the introduction. It's not the same, of course, in Latin America to talk about the law of Argentina, perhaps today Colombia, that you talk about the law of Bolivia, Ecuador, or Guatemala. Certainly there's a hierarchy there. And also there's a hierarchy with regard to the legal academics work in each of these countries. The premises are implicit, but are there, and they're very powerful. That, I think, is very problematic and something that we should also explore and criticize. And the same in the global north, right? It's not the same to be a German law legal scholar than to be a Greek legal scholar, clearly, right? Or to be a French legal scholar, or to be a Spanish legal scholar. And there are hierarchies there too that should be explored and should be criticized. Or what I would argue too is that when there is an interaction between a legal scholar and a legal community from the north and a legal scholar and a legal community from the south, this nuance disappears. Right? So the Spanish scholar wouldn't say, when dealing with a Colombian legal scholar, that he or she is in the low levels of the hierarchy of the European legal communities. What he or she would say is, implicitly, is that she is European, right? And that I am Latin American. That has certain implications for the value of the work that we do and for the value of the contexts where we are looking, context for the production of legal knowledge, right? And what I try to explore mainly, it's not the internal dichotomies, but the big dichotomy between the legal barbarian and the subject. Perhaps this can take me to a point made by Francisca, right? That is, well, what should we do as critical scholars, right? And I think that we should try to work in two areas. On the one hand, I think that the subject of study of each intellectual movement within this broad field of critical legal scholarship, right, is so complex, has so many dimensions, and is so technical that we have to engage in that specialized technical way in order to try to make a contribution and think in deeper ways about those specific objects of study. But at the same time, when we should try to take distance from those technicalities and find common ground with other critical scholars, particularly on the political aims that we have in common, right? And in part, the last chapter of the book of Legal Barbarians what it tries to do is to make explicit that there are some commonalities, despite the big differences within post-colonial and comparative critical studies and etc. And those spaces, those common spaces, are many times lost because of because we focus too much on the specific objects of study that are of our interest, and because we also emphasize too much on the differences that we have, political differences, right? And these, I think, weaken us and weakens the possibility that we have to contribute to changing not only how legal scholarship is done and the legal academy, but also the contributions that we can make to changing social reality. So this dual aim, this dual work, I think, would be valuable. Another point that perhaps was made by Liliana that I would like to address is the hybrid character of what we do, right? I would say it's not only it's not only an expression of what I did in Legal Barbarians, but I think it's an expression of what mainly we have done. Liliana in international law, Francisca in constitutional law, and also I would say David in comparative constitutional law, from a different perspective, coming from the. But what we try to do is to not learn and be permeated by what others have said, and not only learn and use our objects of study, right? International law, comparative law, constitutional law, legal theory. what else? Well, one other point that is connected to what Liliana was saying about people like Calvo and Bello, right? I would say that perhaps it would be useful to distinguish between how they felt about what they were doing, how they interpreted what they were doing, and how others interpreted what they were doing. So I do agree with you, Liliana, and I think it's important to make explicit that Calvo and Bello and others, right, were thinking that they were in the middle of international law and that they were contributing to the creation of international law from within, not from the outside. But I wonder, on the one hand, if this was the perception of other international laws, right? And on the other hand, also, as you were saying, well, Calvo and Bello are exception to the rule, right? Because the rule, I would say, is that Latin America and in the global South in general have been in the margins of the construction of international law. And many of the work, many of the articles and books that you have published try to make explicit this fact and to criticize this fact. Also trying to make explicit the contributions that historically the South has done to the construction of international law. But still, dominant international law, I would say, has not been strongly influenced by the views and the work of global South international law lawyers or academics, right? And I would say that that is the case in other areas that I know more. Now, in constitutional law or in legal theory, we are still and have been for a while in the margins, although interacting with the center and influencing partially the center. Perhaps I can stop there and we can have some more dialogue about this.
Okay, we don't have questions from the audience, so David, Francisca, or Liliana.
I don't have a lot in response. I mean, those very, very interesting, sort of fascinating, comprehensive responses. I think one thing I would say, I think I would return a little bit to the liberal democracy point that you brought up as well, right? Because I think this is, I don't know, I keep being drawn back to sort of my own work, I guess, in some ways, right? But there is this problem of how you respond to the kind of problems at the center of the model that you identify, right? And I think one point is that a lot of the critics are bad faith, I would call them, right? Some. And I'm thinking of Orban's, the Hungarian sort of famous illiberal democracy speech, where he's actually quite proud to identify himself as illiberal, right? Because he is able to kind of heap liberalism as the baggage of a particular set of historical norms and say, well, I'm in opposition to that. And I think that move is fascinating. You see that in Latin America, of course, as well, right? Sometimes. And I think the interesting question maybe in response, or one of them is, then how do you respond within the contours of liberal democracy itself, or as we were kind of saying, what's up for grabs, I think, in a sense. One way to think about it might be more humility about what the content of the model is or ought to be, right? That may be one way to think about it. In other words, we know a lot less. Or another way to say it is to think kind of the contours of what you need or kind of should have, or even what a liberal democratic constitution is much more, there's a set of values in some sense, but we don't really know how to achieve many of the things that sit at the center of the model. I don't know, right? But I think it's sort of a really interesting question that's kind of at the center of comparative constitutional law, right? Is because I think sometimes the response to what I would call the bad faith challenges, which are really in many cases just authoritarians playing a game, I think, with the model. The response is often to kind of identify with whatever is there, right, at a given point in time and just say, well, that's good. And I think that very process has frozen the kind of constitutional experimentation that we need to undertake as a field.
I don't have much to add. It's been very enriching, and we'll be thinking about this for long. But yes, it's I think the point that the way, you know, all these constructions have landed into general understandings of the law, you know, more broadly. I think this is a very important point. And at the same time, you know, this is the difficulty, right? How to build the material conditions to move from this, given the path dependence that we have from this, you know, very, very, I don't know, long-lasting frameworks of, you know, conceptual frame and also institutional conceptions, and particularly in the face of division, you know, in the critical field. You know, I like also the point of specialization, but sometimes I am worried by the way there's, you know, a kind of epistemological non-recognition about the different critical fields, right? Why are you talking about this? You are a man, and you are, you know, and why this is more, and you know, and other things are more serious. You know, these kind of acoustic problems that undermine collective action in the way of transforming the inherited. So probably this is one of the things that, you know, that in the end, like, I don't know, leaves me more concerned in a way about the possibilities of improving, you know. But yeah, I would say just that, but it's been really wonderful. Thank you.
So thank you, Daniel, for connecting to my work. What I wanted to make a point about your question about the international law, if they were actually seen as, or the Latin Americans were seen as in the center of production of knowledge. I think they were in a moment, and there was this whole field of Latin American international law, which was sometimes ridiculed, but that they were seen as participants and as at the center of production. Remember that most of the founding members of the United Nations were Latin American states, right? Like they met throughout the whole 19th century and developed a series of forms of congresses and publications, and you know, and Andres Bello's book and Carlos Calvo's book was taught in Europe. You know, the Spaniards had to use the Latin American books because they hadn't written about international law in the same way. Carlos Calvo probably spoke better French than he did Spanish, and his books were used to teach in France for many years, right? Alvarez lived in Geneva most of his life, and was also at the forefront of all of the institutions that were founded in the first half of the 20th century, and the first Latin American judge of the International Court of Justice, right? And I think my former student, Mauricio Moscoso, who wrote about the famous Peru-Colombia case of asylum before the ICJ, where they had to discuss this idea of Latin American international law. It lost, like it wasn't accepted as such, but it was there at the forefront of the discussion, and it's still. But this doesn't mean, I mean, and I think you cite me in that way, that the contribution argument, which I've always been hesitant to invoke, because there were a lot of texts of the first half of the 20th century speaking about the contribution of Latin America to international law, the contribution, but those contribution arguments are very uncritical. Like they are uncritical, and they are very elitist in the way that they view the region, the peoples in the region, and the type of projects for progress or the future. So they are Latin American in that sense, that they promote them as such, but it doesn't mean that they are, let's say, constructive, progressive forms of viewing the structure of international law to help the diverse majority of the population in the region. However, in the Cold War era, we enter another way of using Latin American perspectives in international law, from what the Mexican, after the Mexican Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, all of the social movements that appear in the second half of the 20th century. So there's a new type of challenge to that structure of international law that is both from within and from without, or from below, like Raja Gopal says in his famous book. So I think that they have been recognized, but as participants and as creators of international law, but it doesn't always mean that it is a critical, progressive way of using international law, right? So and I think that point that you made about the different, even inside the European academic or legal spheres, there are these their own legal barbarians, like the way that the Spanish are viewed at some point, the Portuguese, or even the Nordic periphery of the European states, or the Soviet internationalists of the 1950s and 60s, which criticized the whole capitalist Christian structure of international law from a Soviet perspective, right? So they have that whole version of international law as well. So I think it is a little bit more complex than a marginalization of the South from international law. They have been, even in 12, which you mentioned Macau many times, you cite Macau Mutua many times in your what is 12. Macau, we've met in several conferences and several moments. And the first time that I presented Alvarez in a 12 conference, he said, "That is not 12. Like, why are you bringing this white racist guy to 12? Like, that's." I said, "But wait a minute, the Africa independence movements in the 20th century all cite, the Latin Americans as their model for what they were doing with independence, and doctrines like of uti possidetis juris, they use that, and so it's very interesting how Macau Mutua would see 12 at one point, and then we met many years later, and I had written on Haiti, and I had written other stuff, and he says, like, everything you do is 12. That's amazing, right? Everything. So I, it was strange to sometimes be part of 12 and other times not to be part of 12. So even in 12, there is a whole, there is no homogeneity in 12. And some who have written about 12 see 12 in three moments, like first 12, second 12, and third 12, that I wrote a little bit about that on an article on peripheral histories of international law. And the second and third 12 are students of the first 12ers, which are the new international economic law people of the 60s and 70s, and new histories of international law. But these are the third world who want to be part of the United Nations and not marginal, but they want to retell this story in a way. And then the second and third 12 say, the first 12, they were great, they did wonderful work, but they weren't radical or critical enough. We have to go even further, like, because we have to get issues of race in there. We have to be more stronger, more radical on the economic side. So I think even in these critical milieus, there is a lot of different perspectives and contestations, and not even schools of thought anymore, because I don't think they're more academic environments where we can express different positions, but there's a lot of diversity even from the theoretical tools that we use. So anyway, I just wanted to add that. But you never answered my art question that several of us have pointed at, that how would you deal with that creative side where you make these connections? Like, are you thinking of another book going further? Because I really think that's a fascinating contribution that you made there as well.
Thank you, Liliana. Well, yes, in past articles and in some books, I've tried to explore this dialogue between art and law. And what I would like to do now is one of the pieces that I'm focusing on now is to reflect from a theoretical perspective about this dialogue, right? What would it mean to create channels of communication between art and law? Why would it be useful? What would be a disadvantage? What would be the different ways of putting into dialogue these two fields, right? That's what I would like to do. And also what I would like to do in other pieces is to continue using particular pieces of art that would be useful to think about the specific object of study that I'm exploring in that piece, right? So I'm working on issues related to the rights of nature from a comparative perspective, and also from this geopolitics of legal knowledge. And I would like to continue thinking about the work done in the Andean Baroque period to try to think about hybridity. That is, I think, a key point in this discussion about rights of nature. Now, with regard to footnotes, there was another point that we touched before and that is connected to this one. I used a lot of footnotes because in many other pieces that you read about, these masters of comparative law, these masters of political theory or legal theory, you hear only the interpretation of the legal scholar that is now the author of the book or of the article. So of course you have many footnotes, but if you don't go and read Montesquieu's piece or Main's piece, right, you don't know how well-founded is this interpretation, right? And what I wanted to do was to create a dialogue between my interpretation that was in the body of the text and the voice of the authors that were being interpreted in this part, trying to show the reader, right, that my interpretation was based on these specific passages of these classical books, and also to try to provide tools for those that are interested in continuing this path, right, to go to the main sources and try to explore new interpretations or criticize mine, right? That was the main aim of using so many footnotes. Also, I used them in a trying to react to possible objections about my interpretations of these main authors, right? Saying, well, why are you're criticizing these key paradigmatic authors, right? And there are so many good interpretations of the work of these guys. Where are you basing your critical views, right? And my point with these footnotes is, well, here, right? In these passages are key part of these very well-known books and articles that many claim that have read, but not many actually read.
Can I respond to that?
Okay, I'm sorry. It's 12:31.
Okay.
So, but we can.
But
we
I
can
just want to say
continue.
it was
We
not
can
a
Go ahead.
criticism to the footnotes. It was exactly the strategy of the footnotes that I wanted to know
Okay.
about. Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry.
So no, I just want to thank you all for all the comments, the critique, the questions. These dialogues are always useful. Try to take distance from the work that you do and try to find the weak spots and try to work harder in future pieces to try to neutralize this way. Thank you very much.
Okay. We thank you all of you for these productive panels. We're very proud of having you here, and thank you, Professor Bonilla, for this book, for this marvelous book, and thank you all for this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for creating this opportunity to have this lively discussion.
Thank you, Gurpreet.
Ciao.
Chao. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.